All right, so welcome everybody. This is yet another in our series of discussions on Heidegger. This time we're reading On the Essence of Truth from Basic Writings, about 25 pages. Rather compact essay in terms of the amount of stuff that it covers in that period of time, contemporary with some of the stuff we were doing in contributions and most of its themes. And then for next time, the plan is to go to this book, Basic Questions of Philosophy, which has some similar ground on the traditional concept of truth as correctness, anchoring that back into the Greeks, and then trying to understand the fundamental comportment, in his terms, of the Greeks in that period as wonder. And then along the way, he's also contrasting some of that with his own understanding. Traditional concept of truth as Aletheia, and wonder as a basic comportment of philosophy in the Greeks is kind of the topic of the book. And we will be doing that over the first few months of next year. The first session of that is, I'm planning for that to be on the 19th of January. And then how much of the reading we want to do, whether it's on the order of 50 pages or on the order of 90 pages, is still up in the air. I'm going to poll people about it. Anyway, that's the plan for the next thing. If people are interested in getting the book beforehand, this is the book we're looking for. And sorry about that. My background sometimes wants to obscure this. For January. I do think at some point we'll do additional readings from the Basic Writings book, if you got that, although I think some people may have gotten the PDF for just the single essay from Pete's website, and it's in other collections as well. So anyway, that's just background on what we're going to do next and what our original reading for this was. A little bit on format for new people. We generally go around the room, get first impressions from people. That includes whether or not you managed to do the reading, previous familiarity with this essay specifically, or the rest of Heidegger if you're new to the group, so we can understand sort of what level to put things at. And then when you give first impressions, I'm also especially interested in anything that seemed obscure to you or you want to make sure that we cover.
Description of
sorry, we got a bit of a background noise.
In the American South.
Sorry, who is talking in the background?
I think it's James.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I had to mute James. I think he's having a conversation with someone else in the other room, which I can understand, but one conversation at a time on the stream at least. Sorry, I was saying that in first reactions, we're especially interested in anything we want to cover in the discussion period, in the didactic period. After we do the round robin first impressions and raising topics we sure you want to cover, I'll try to go through the essay in some detail with sort of my own take on some of these things. That'll be a little bit interactive with me asking questions and so forth, but a lot of it will be just my own take on them. And then, along the way, want to get everybody's questions about any of those things, any of the concepts that were unclear to people. Kind of first trying to just understand the argument that Heidegger is laying out, but then also our own reactions to it, our own, what he does or doesn't convince us of, we can keep some of that toward the end of the essay. So, sorry, end of the discussion after the essay. Anyway, that's just the basic format of what we want to do. And for the round robin part, I'll say if you haven't done the reading, you just want to listen, that's just fine. We also like questions from people who are new. Just let us know in the round robin, and we can go through that part quickly. So Josh, first impressions. Want to start us off?
Yeah. Well, his distinction, his drawing up a notion of truth, which is not intuitive for most people who do think of truth as in terms of correctness, is I find that very important, and not only do I find it important, but it leads to. I would like to discuss the potential. I think that there are different ways in which we can talk about or interpret the implications of his notion of truth. Because one way to do it would be to say that he leaves in place a usefulness of truth as correctness. And what I have in mind here is specifically how to understand what it is that the sciences are doing when they attempt to ascertain truth, that is to say, scientific empirical notions of validity. So that would be one way of understanding the distinction that he's making between truth as aletheia and truth as correctness, where you can leave truth as correctness in place as and just think of his notion of truth as aletheia as a kind of sort of the creative impetus or generator for the latter. I'm particularly interested in sort of the alternative, which is one that you would find in a different way in Nietzsche. And I recognize, Heidegger's critiques of Nietzsche, but I think in this respect, with regard to this notion of truth, I think that he would be sympathetic to Nietzsche, where truth as correctness becomes something that is put into question as not illusory, but as kind of lacking or missing something within itself, misunderstanding something. So that would be my interest is to sort of go around.
Yeah. So I mean, we definitely want to talk about that, about how much the understanding of there being something more fundamental underlying the notion of truth as correctness leaves in place correctness, what it does with correctness, or the correctness layer, if you can put it that way. I do agree that there's a fundamental shift of perspective that we have to talk about what it leaves and what it doesn't leave. I think that Nietzsche may also be involved in wanting to displace some of those notions of truth, but I think his reasons for doing so are very different from Heidegger's. I don't know that he would. I doubt that Heidegger would agree very much where Nietzsche may come on that. But certainly both of them share the problematic of truth, and we do have to consider that with similarity and contrast. He himself contrasts himself, I would say, in this essay more with Hegel on the one hand and Kant on the other, but we can definitely bring up the question you raised, and the idea of how much does the truth as correctness simply remain behind as a structure in its own right, that it is undisturbed by what Heidegger is doing, and how much does he think that it's something fundamental is added to the change notion of the essence of truth he's getting at. That's a fine question. Obviously did the reading. Pete.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important essay in Heidegger terms, because this is where he first gets the withdrawal of being in the clearing. It's the first time he brings it up. But overall, I think it's a real train wreck of him trying to explain what he's trying to do. He's got the undisclosedness, the non-essence of the untruth. This makes contributions, which, we finished last time, an example of clarity, which you wouldn't have thought while we were reading it. But I think it's really a mess in terms of vocabulary. His ideas, once you understand his concepts and what he's introducing, now we can explain them clearly. But back in 1930, I'm not sure what people made of this. And even the translation, it's supposed to be the same translation by John Sallis, but there's places where in the German he's using sein with a Y, and in one place they go being with a Y, but in other places they go back to being with an I in the basic writings version. But in the path marks version, which is supposed to be the same, they go with being with an I, so I'm assuming those are printer's errors or something. So yeah, this is one of the most confusing essays in terms of him trying to explain things that are new to people, but are fairly straightforward ideas. But with his vocabulary, that this is why, I guess he gets his reputation as being ineffable and or just very difficult to understand.
Yeah, so there's definitely a love of paradox in this essay, and we'll definitely have to talk about that as a device. I would say that this is a very compact formulation, but the reason for the compact formulation is well, I don't know if it's the only reason. I see a value in the compact formulation of trying to rapidly get people to the synoptic view, right? It's trying to get people to notice all of the way and not just the steps. And the way to do that is to compress the presentation of the steps so much that you can actually see the way. And I take him to be consciously doing that here. There's formulations in here where, single little sections, 3 pages long, would otherwise be a book, right? So, and I find that valuable in sort of understanding where he's going, why he's going there. There are also the presentation of the why for the steps from one to the other are extremely compact, and therefore it can be hard to follow. Where did that come from? He occasionally interjects in other voices his imaginary objections to what people mean by freedom, for example, and even teasing out the multi-layers of that can be hard. Is this the voice of an objector, or is this Heidegger's own voice? And what is he actually saying here? And you're right that the rhetoric can be difficult to penetrate there, but he also is trying to hit the key points of why he's taking a step from one to the other. And that can have a certain kind of clarity to the kind of person, if I go to this way, who is used to reading Hegel's Science of Logic, right? He's making big moves in 2 pages, right? That are, deepenings or reversals. And yes, it's true that you won't find all the reasoning for that step of the full fleshing out of it. And you're right also that some of the key concepts here, like untruth, are certainly new to most people reading it, but that's exactly why we have sessions like this, to try to unpack them for people. But okay, that's a good reaction. Try to keep in mind that this is, because it's compact and because the things are paradoxical, this can be difficult to follow. I've read it so often that it doesn't have quite that same impenetrability to me, but I can recognize there were times when I read similar essays, when the first time I read them, they did have that kind of impenetrability to me. So it is something to keep in mind. All right, anything else you want to cover about what we should raise? Oh, you're good. Okay. Dan, first reactions.
So yeah, I read this book a few years ago, and now I read this essay. I think I read it like 3 times in the last week, and I every time I reread it, I felt like there is more there and more unpacking and more. It's quite deep actually, and I appreciate. I agree. It's very condensed, and it's a lot of stuff there, and I think it's a very important one. This topic of truth, and he's taking it here and he's kind of touching all his points, and he's covering a lot of ground, like time, books, like it's. The being in time is there, and whatever he came up with contributions and other stuff, and he's wrestling with them and he's trying to present them clearly, and I really like that. And also I think I like how he develops the argument. He starts like with correctness or correspondence, and then he said, well, what's behind this? It cannot brief like free floating. It needs to be something there, and he goes, and so there is something, and then he goes deeper, and then he goes freedom, and then it's Dasein, and it's existence, and it's yeah, all that stuff, and types of philosophy, like proper philosophy, sophistry, common philosophy, common sense, and I really like that, and Dasein, and it's adding more and more, and it's you can see the big picture and the entire process, and I really like that.
Yeah, there's definitely a how much more kind of a thing going on here. And, the first move or two may be familiar, if I can put it this way, somewhat familiar Kantian condition of possibility type thinking. And you can find the places where this or that thing is indebted to a neo-Kantian method or to Husserlian phenomenology in like sections 1 and 2, so to speak, as well as to truth is correctness out of Aristotle or something. But then it rapidly takes off from a point or two established by that, and then it zooms. And the level of abstraction as it zooms is it can be hard to follow. It can be dizzying, but it's also it's impressive in its own way. But anyway, I like the essay for that reason, for the themes that it brings up. But we'll try to do justice to those in the discussion. Tara, first of all, welcome, and you want to give us your first reactions, and did you manage to do the reading and all that kind of thing?
Sure. I'm in Eastern philosophy and religion, and I came to this article with that mindset, and it took me a while to kind of figure out what's going on in the beginning when he was talking about the correspondence, that a statement plus if the statement matches reality, then that equals truth, and that's kind of a correspondence way of thinking about truth. But then he talks about the letting things be. And there's something about the idea that if we can appreciate the world and allow things to kind of show us their truth, to be humble in that experience, I started thinking about a mindfulness and how the freedom aspect might be the freedom to let go of our preconceived notions about things, especially truth and untruth, and to allow it to reveal itself. To me, that sounds like mindfulness or present-mindedness or meditation even. And then another part about to engage with the world more thoughtfully and to learn to be more open and humble in our approach to knowledge. I think in 1943, when this article was written, that'd be pretty novel, because it feels, again, with an Eastern bent on egolessness and kind of subtracting the ego from the equation and being present in the world.
I mean, useful perspective. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that he's getting at something like a mindfulness, an open mindfulness underneath the notion of correctness as being something more fundamental about attunement to the realm in which truth occurs, something like that. And there are definitely connections of that to similar notions of mindfulness in Eastern philosophy. I would say also in other traditions in Western philosophy as well. There are definitely echoes of this in the Greeks. There's echoes of this in the mystical tradition. There's other traditions in the West that are already talking about things in these terms. But that's a useful way of thinking about this. We do want to understand how he's going from correctness to that mindfulness layer, because he's trying to actually connect those two up, and that's a place where he's sort of most in contact with the philosophy of his own time, things like neo-Kantianism, things like Husserlian phenomenology. But where he goes after that is all informed by the mindfulness attunement layer, rather than by just the contemporary European philosophy he's coming out of. But okay, thanks, and I'll definitely try to cover the mindfulness attunement aspect as we get to the discussion of the didactic part. Mr. Doyle, don't have a front name, so I'll just call you Doyle. You want to give us your reaction?
Yeah, reaction. So managed to make it through the work. Wish I had spent a little more time on sections 6, 7, and 8, because that's really the payoff. Have read a little Heidegger before, certainly the question concerning technology. I only just found out about this meetup a little later than I would have liked, but I'm very glad to be here to study this with y'all. I certainly have questions. I can see the comments already mirroring my own, this being very compact. You can tell this is very compact and puts a lot of ideas in short successive order here. I love trying to piece together the disparate terms that he uses. And I'm certainly most curious today about looking into errancy. and
Yep.
mystery. And
Yes, absolutely.
just the idea of question, right? And then that leads into philosophy and as was mentioned earlier, you know, attunement and sort of just this process of truth and disclosure, non-disclosure. All those are terms all over the place, but certainly most specifically looking into, you know, errancy and how man errs, and you know, I suppose the process of questioning and its place in that.
Yeah, it sounds great. So glad you found us. If you don't know, I mean, we do put up on YouTube the session videos afterwards. So we've got a whole back history of several years there. If you look, it's just my name, Jason Cawley, on YouTube. And if you look up that in Heidegger, you usually find it. But we've got the sort of videos of the discussions over the last several years, including a lot of material on Heidegger. So welcome to check it out. Happy to have you. And absolutely, we're going to go through what he means by mystery, errancy. There's a connection from freedom through untruth to mystery to errancy. That's an actual, you know, it's not just separate terms, but they hang together in a way. There's a fundamental or core connecting tissue between them that we want to bring out. But you do have to understand what each of the terms along the way, what the signposts, so to speak, mean to understand what those steps are. And those, I would say that those are probably the key things which are terms introduced in this essay. This is the essay that's about what he means by the mystery, what he means by errancy, as opposed to some of the other things. There's consideration of truth as Althea is in lots of other books. But the place where you get mystery and errancy is definitely here. All right, so we definitely want to cover that. Trevor, do you want to go next? First, welcome. You're still on mute.
Yes, I was. Thank you so much for hosting this. It's great to be with you. By the way, I'm your neighbor up in Kingman.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
But we're not going to hold that against me. And if you live in Arizona, you'll understand why I make that joke, although it's beautiful. Some background in Heidegger, even though I studied literature and not philosophy proper, but yeah, really great to be here. This is a side point. One of the things that I really was fascinated by the first few sections was actually something that Tara kind of alluded to as well. And I hadn't thought about this until you shared, Tara, but when you brought up Eastern philosophy, I was thinking already about how much truth for the first half of the lecture is rooted in language. And so inadvertently or consciously, there seems to be a wrestling with a tension between language and being and thoughts and this wonderful exploration of knowledge in this sort of rubrics cube. But I was thinking, with what you shared is the opening of the Tao Te Ching, right? And so they're in these different traditions wrestling with where does knowledge come from? What is the relationship between a thing and what we name it? And how that's so incestuously entwined in language. And so for me reading this essay, I was really fascinated by the critiques about language that are just sort of nestled in the lecture.
Okay, we definitely want to talk about the language connection. You're absolutely right to bring that out. So first of all, but there's because the truth is correctness idea is focused on the idea that truth is a property of propositions, propositional truth. And he's trying to show that that itself rests upon a deeper possibility if that's more about this attunement and openness business, Aletheia disclosure. But then it's still the case that part of the motivation for that move is related to how language can relate to experienced beings at all, right? Of what it means to bring something to language in his terms, right? So the reason that we are looking for truth relations, not in sort of representational space, but in something like truth space, something like that, is because we need a commensurability between what our language is about and what language can say and the beings that it's referring to. And this is, you get a very compact, it's not quite a definition, but it's an allusion to what has been usually referred to as being in that. So anyway, so connection of language both to the proposition on the one hand and to being on the other, or to meaning. Okay, so absolutely, there are whole understandings of language in later Heidegger that aren't really here yet. They're just sort of pointed at. He's not going to say here things like language is the house of being that he'll say in some of his later works. But there already is this tie-in of the reason we need to go to a level beneath truth is correctness is because we have to find the environment in which anything like a statement can correspond to anything about a matter or thing or being at all. I don't know if that helps, but that's one of the things we definitely want to get to when we get to that step. It's kind of the step between 1 and 2 in the essay. All right, thanks for your questions. John, you want to go next? I'm sorry, Trevor, do you have a comment first?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, that wasn't a question, that was a statement.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I because of my work with Derrida and I read Being in Time, but it's been 15 years ago since I've studied it. It was just something that fascinates me because of what I do.
Fair enough.
And so it's a side point, absolutely. But it was one that I was really fascinated with to see. And also, I guess I should have said this too. Just I think it's really, I mean, just amazing. It's very clear to me how much Sartre is indebted to this early works of Heidegger, and we see it in this pretty clearly.
Okay, fair enough. John, you want to go next?
Hey, Jason. First of all, I just wanted to express my gratitude. I was struggling through basic problems, and I stumbled on your reading group from last year, and it was just enormously helpful.
You're most welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm a relatively new Heideggerian. I stumbled on the Dreyfus lectures back in the spring, and I kind of absorbed them over the summer. I think the first text I was able to get through was Origin of the Work of Art. And I have actually read Basic Questions and a couple other things consequently. So I'm able to sort of read some of the slightly later stuff. And this feels familiar to Basic Questions. I want to say one thing about every time I read him, he says this thing about the word truth. He says it's time-worn, a dulled word. And I feel like so many of the words and phrases like let it be, letting things be. I mean, we grew up with the Beatles album cover. Words like freedom, they're asleep, you know, and I feel like Heidegger makes you kind of wake up to the obviousness of that. The obviousness of the world is what's concealing the mystery behind it, or the deeper thing that it contains.
And you see that in shop-worn words becoming alive for you again.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that, you know, yeah. And one last thing is just specifically the word comportment keeps coming up all the time. And every time it comes up, I have to stop and say, well, I have to rephrase the word. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, how you deal with those kinds of words that you feel like he uses so often, and it maybe is actually a stumbling block rather than an opening for you. So
yeah, we can definitely talk about comportment. I mean, in part because of background reading Husserl, I have other associations with comportment. Comportment is kind of a generalization of the intentionality structure of relationship between consciousness and transcendent object, something like that. But comportment is a more fundamental and not necessarily conscious attunement to the other than the Dasein. So I like to, he will talk about this in terms of open comportment, and we'll get there when we get to the subject matter, but in the same way that intentionality was referring to the fact that there's this pointer-like character of consciousness, that it's not trying to talk about itself, it's trying to talk about something it's trying to refer to, which is transcendent of the consciousness in Husserlian terms. There is a relational character and an open relational character to all disclosure, right? And that's what this comportment idea is trying to get at. It's trying to get at the fact that we're, I remember there was a book on some medieval mystic I was reading one point, and the author, secondary source author, was not the secondary writer, was trying to explain what was or wasn't possible for the unaided human intellect. And I was just stopped by that phrase. There's no such animal. There's
Right.
no unaided human intellect. The human intellect is always already outside in the world, plugged into the world, receiving structure from the world, embedded in it, open to it. It's all window, right? And
Right.
that notion of the relatedness to transcendent, if you get me, is to me what the word comportment first of all means. It means that there is an always already focused on, attuned to, related to a not just other than or more than, but a truth or ground like transcended. And there's the notion that every comportment like that has this openness to it is something we'll also get to in that part of the essay. But that to me is what the term really means, and it helps me to think of it as a dramatic amplification and widening of the notion of intentionality in previous Husserlian phenomenology, which was a much more limited and logical way of understanding this basic structure. But the basic structure involved is shattering of subjectivisms, if I can put it this way, because it's pointing out that the structures of what a subjectivist philosopher would regard as consciousness or the subjective whole itself are in themselves trying to get outside just the consciousness, right? And there's no reason for them to do that. There's nothing there, right? Or if it's closed off, it's not closed off. That's the deduction from the structure existing at all. And that basic point about intention in the form of intentionality was already there in Husserlian phenomenology, but Heidegger with comportment has made it much more. He's broadened it much more, and he is also understanding Dasein as fundamentally way more open than Husserl understood consciousness to be, if that makes sense. Does that help?
Yes.
Great. All right, James, first reactions.
Oh yeah, thanks, Jason. Would you say that in terms of Husserl and his phenomenology, at some point Heidegger leaves that form of comportment and intentionality behind, and he's maybe associating that kind of idea of truth in terms of correctness and objectivity, and transitions to his more truth as unconcealment and also concealment.
He certainly is trying to go he's certainly shifting that notion of truth. Truth is not just going to be unconcealment, but it's going to go through disclosure and concealment to something more like essential occurrence of being, something like that, how being actually happens or unfolds. And there are all kinds of changes involved in that, but that's kind of the whole span of the essay rather than just a single point along the way. In terms of how this relates to Husserl, we already saw in the very early Heidegger in Being in Time, I don't know if that's very early, but in early commonly known Heidegger, Being in Time, that he was using the ideas about intentionality that are already there from Husserl, but immediately broadening them. And from his point of view, intentionality is way too narrowly focused on a theoretical attitude and also way too subjectivist a reading of what is really going on. But his replacement for that is the notion of of Dasein as ecstatic, as outside of itself. But that's, you can recognize the signature or the influence of intentionality on the notion of ecstasies in being and time. And to me, comportment is a generalization and making more, put it this way, formulaic, that same notion. So I don't know if that helps, but in terms of just differentiating between influence and conclusions of it, if you compare what Husserl was able to do with even intentionality and phenomenology, he was able to demolish various kinds of psychologisms, various kinds of subjectivisms that presenting the mind as more locked in itself than it actually is, if I can put it that way. And that opening is one that, from my history of philosophy, with my history of philosophy hat on, Heidegger proceeded to drive a truck through, right? But that opening had already been created before him by his teacher, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay, Joe, you want to give us your first impressions, topics we should cover, anything like that? Oh. Maybe not. So going on, chance for Joe. All right. If Joe just wants to listen, that's fine. So we should go from those first impressions to topics of the essay. So just first of all, a brief overview, right? We have an intro section where there's a little bit of sort of, if I can put it this way, throat clearing about common sense and how this is going to be philosophy, and philosophy isn't quite like common sense. And I'll point out at least one thing about that before we go further. And then we have the early sections where we're talking about traditional understandings of truth. And to begin with, he starts with this, making much of this distinction between material and propositional truth. And then he'll get to truth as correctness and this adequatio notion. But all of that is kind of the part where he's going through common sense and traditional philosophical understandings of the question he's trying to raise. All of that is springboard. The fundamental place he's going to is he's trying to show that the traditional understanding of truth has a kind of presupposed level, which condition of possibilities fashion, he's going to say is the kind of underlying, a more underlying phenomena, a more underlying phenomenology behind how truth can happen. And that's going to be the springboard for his regarding the correspondence understanding of truth as being only a limited one and not the basic one. So just basic divisions of the essay, everything up to and including the discussion of the correspondence theory of truth is kind of views before, right? And then there's a kind of linchpin of going beyond that to more like this truth as openness, open relatedness and comportment. And then the rest is going to be things which are built upon that after he's made that shift or move. So you can think of that as being the linchpin or hinge that the essay turns on. Once he's got to the comportment level, he's going to ask all sorts of questions about that comportment level its own, which is where we're going to get to questions of freedom and untruth and the mystery and errancy and all the other stuff that we go through in the whole second half of the essay. But I just want you to understand ahead of time, there's a discussion of kind of received opinion, if you get me, and critique of received opinion, where there's this critical move, if I can put it that way, on the traditional understanding of truth that is a very, put it this way, a neo-Kantian and Husserlian kind of move. It is a conditions of possibility, what the phenomena tell us must be going on here, kind of move on that traditional understanding that forms the linchpin. But after the linchpin, everything after that is, I mean, even his formulation of that linchpin is Heidegger specific, but it's even early, something you find in early Heidegger. Everything after that is very much Heidegger specific and on his own trajectory. Okay. I want to just briefly mention the only thing I wanted to point out in the very early section, kind of throat clearing of this is not going to be like common sense, so your common sense objections aren't necessarily an objection, something like that. he begins the whole thing, though, with saying that we're talking about the essence of truth, and the essence of truth is not about this or that truth, this or that particular kind of truth. So I just point out, this is already a one in the many. It's already an appeal to a common. It's already a very Platonic kind of move of we want the one idea, not the variety that occurs. So there is simply because this is trying to do philosophy, there is a commonality in conceptual thinking with Platonic roots, if you get me. That's there in that first section. I'm not saying that goes any farther than that. It's just this is a already marked at the beginning as a philosophical exercise to arrive at an essence as a common across the class, right? And as we'll see by the end, common across the class is not where he eventually comes out on what to think of as essence. But here it still is, right? Okay. That's all I wanted to say about that early intro section, the section before one. As for one, there's two fundamental ideas I want to cover there. One is the material versus propositional understandings of truth, and then we get to the thing which they have in common, which is this correspondence or adequatio. But I want to first focus on the why is he doing this thing with the material versus the propositional form of truth. I mean, most of the rest of the stuff seems to be based entirely upon a critique of the propositional understanding of truth, if we put it that way. And yet he goes out of his way to say that we think of true as true gold as opposed to counterfeit gold, not just as truth of a proposition, which is this notion of something like material truth. Why is he doing that? What role does it perform for him here that he wants there to be material as well as propositional truth before he even gets to the critique of any of this? Anyone else notice that or have thoughts about that? I have my own answer, but I'd love if someone else has a stab at it. Dan or Pete, do you have a stab at why he's bringing up the notion of material truth as well as propositional truth? Why does he want both of them?
Well, isn't it just
Trevor,
because
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry,
isn't
go
it
ahead.
just
Pete.
because they're both indicating ways of different types of correspondence?
I think that's right, but they're not just different types, they're from different sides, effectively. They're whether or not the thing corresponds to the concept or the concept corresponds to the thing, right? It's imagining that the adjustment involved in correspondence can be an adjustment from either end, so to speak, as opposed to being locked into the idea that it is the thought chiseling itself until its concept matches the reality outside. The idea that there can be false gold implies that there can be a something outside which has falseness attributed to it by the fact that it does not match the a priori concept, instead of the falseness that would arise if your judgments didn't match what was the case about the object. Trevor, hand up. But you're on mute.
I know. I was looking for a section in the reading. I'll hold off on that. You know, one of the things that really interests me in this, and I was wrestling with your question, what is he trying to do in this section? And I think it's a really provocative question that I hadn't asked myself. So I was pondering it, and I will continue to ponder it. But on the surface, I think one of the points he's getting at is, you know, we talk about gold or false gold, and I was thinking, what I was looking for was the discussion of the two the coins that he talked about.
The five marked coins.
The marks, yes.
That's at the start of two, very start of two,
It's at
page
the start
120.
of two. Then I'm going to hold off on that and stay with one. But he really is getting at kinds of being as well. and coming at being from this side. Because if you talk about, well, this is true gold and that's false gold, but false gold still exists. He doesn't use that word. I'm using that
He
word.
says it's actual. He says explicitly that it's still actual.
Right. He
On
didn't use the word
117, yeah.
existence, but I'm using that for a specific reason. But I think he's asking the audience to conceptualize being separate from the way other people might have conceptualized it in a more analytical point of view, in a logical, syllogistic way.
He will eventually get to bringing up being when he gets to the open part, but here he's not brought up the problem of being at all. He could have been addressing this with like a Husserlian machinery of different meanings of being in different spheres of relation or something like that. And there may even be some allusions to those in the beginning part with the whole typology of economic calculation, technical consideration, or political sagacity, and all that kind of stuff. But he doesn't use that here. He when he's talking about the genuine gold, he's interested in the fact that we use the word genuine for it, even though the actuality is equally there on both sides of it. So, but I think that this is preliminary to the idea that this correspondence, where the matter could be in accord or the proposition could be in accord, in either case, this being in accord business is something that can involve adjustment from either end, if I can put it that way. Dan?
Yeah, so related to this, so I think he's asking here, like in this theory of correspondence, what makes this possible, and what in metaphysics makes this possible. And he to me here he goes back to Plato and ideas, and he said behind this is ideas. And he said, look, in the medieval period, it was God there. God created according to ideas, and that's why we have this type of two correspondences, like, as you put it, material and propositional. And then said, in modernity, we still keep the same structure, except now we have what he calls their world reason, the logical, and this is kind of like now the reason supplies the law for itself and makes it's automatically intelligible and in no need of justification. And to me here he's laying the ground and kind of pointing to his enemy, which is again Plato and his ideas, and he wants to take that down. And he said both these two types of correspondence are going back to the ideas and to the logical. And yeah,
I mean, he could easily have gone here with the correspondence of that the correspondence between the idea and the thing, and between the idea and the proposition are both correspondences with the third, the idea, and made this a straight Plato discussion. Instead, you get the two kinds. There's a reference to the fact that the material kind is not really the Kantian version of objects are already, as potential objects of experience, something which has a subjective or projected by the mind kind of structure or pull to them. He mentions that, but precisely to contrast that with what he's saying is actually going on in this correspondence, which is, as you said, the medieval notion, whereby the medieval notion, he's talking about the idea that everything is created in accordance with an idea, according to a plan of an idea. So he takes the Platonism that he might be attacking here, and he doesn't talk about it in terms of idea. He talks about it in terms of this theological notion of the created entity. So if people aren't following, right, the gloss here is that the adequatio formula, which is a scholastic formula, it comes from the Middle Ages. At the time when it's actually formulated, it's about this idea that, or this notion that the entity itself is true when it is in conformity with its idea, which is something like what the being is as a thought in the mind of God. And on the other hand, the human mind is performing correctly when it arrives at that same idea about it. So there is a thought likeness in things already. That thought likeness that is in things already is not some surface fact read off of them, as the literal notion of idea might mean, and a face they show, but is an underlying plan or essence, right? That is thought-like because it is essence-like, because it is beings being thoughts in the mind of God sort of view from the scholastic period. So there's a notion of beings originating as thoughts, and there's a notion of that's why they can correspond, that's why the human mind can correspond to them in thought. There's a thought likeness in the human mind, and there's a thought likeness in the beings themselves. But the thought likeness in the beings themselves is imagined as having been put there by a divine mind, right? So the correspondence of the being with the divine mind and of the human mind with the pattern of the divine mind is itself a correspondence, which is part of the human mind doing the thing it is designed to do divinely, something like that. Sorry, Trevor, do you still have your, you want to make another comment, or is your hand just up from last night? Go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about being. The reason why I was saying about the false gold and the gold and its relationship to being, and this is really interesting to me in terms of language as well. But and for me, I am using the book, so it's on page 117, where Heidegger will say. By the way, just before I read this, the earlier section is all about how we pronounce things. And I don't mean pronounce them like correctly, but when we say them.
Got it. Please stand point, sorry. If you're pointing us 117, give us 117, the part you want.
I beg your pardon, sir. I'm setting up my point. It is on point. It is on point. I understand what you're saying, but when he says here something is not in accord, stimmt nicht.
Yes.
And this is, of course, what's not true. On the other hand, we say of whatever is as it should be, it is in accord. The matter is in accord, die Sache stimmt. And this is, of course, rooted in language. And then he continues. However, we call true not only an actual joy, genuine gold, and all beings of such kind, but also, and above all, we call true or false our statements about beings. And so while he's dealing with propositions, as you rightly said, he's already articulating that he's going to be asking, where do we get at being? What is its relationship to words? And we have in those quotations like Stimme. So it is absolutely rooted in language. So my point about language is integral to what he's doing here. But he's playing with these terms in such an interesting way that he's getting at being from the side without actually stating it yet. And it's there in the sentences. And I think that's so fascinating and worth exploring.
I understand what you're saying, but to me in that section, because he's already at the end of the previous paragraph said that it can be the matter that it is in accord, right? Not quite the thing, there's an E at the end, so it's matter, not thing, but that's what can be in accord. But in the second immediately following paragraph, the also and above all, the true or false is our statements about beings. It's not simply our statements about beings as opposed to our statements about things which aren't, right? It's the contrast here is between the matter and the statement, right? And in section 2, he's going to be all about how do we get anything like a statement to be in accord with anything like a matter at all, right? He hasn't raised that yet, but that's going to be the subject of section 2. Here, he's just making the contrast between the proposition and the matter itself as being things which can be in accord, which I take to just be the two notions of truth, the material and propositional truth that he's laying out here. Okay, but I agree with you. He certainly is playing with what stimmt does in German, because it's one of the ways of saying true in German, but it also means this accord thing. It has all these other accord things. Dan?
Yeah, related regarding the material truth. That's also something there, like there is an a priori expectation that, and that goes back to the idea. It's we expect something to be in a certain way, and to me it's not an original truth also, that material truth. It goes back to the idea, and that I think he's trying to show that both of them go back to idea in different ways, and this material is not so obvious, but it's still there.
So I agree with you, he's trying to get that, but I mean, I think that the section where he brings up the fact that the adequatio formula has a kind of metaphysical background that's either first the theological one and then the world reason one. I didn't get to the discussion of the world reason one that you mentioned. That's clearly Hegel, right? The next section there where he talks about detaching from the idea of a creation and talking about it in terms of the world order and the world reason. That's a Hegelian notion of the same thing, and he's pointing out that it's kept the structure, removed the God term at the top and put in a world reason in its place. At the end of 120, he relaxes both of those and he goes back to just the very old Greek notion that you get even in the pre-Socratics of a sameness between statement or logos and ta pragma, right? Which would take you to Aristotle, Plato, even Heraclitus and Parmenides in a way, right? It's that layer. The point of all that is, yes, in this section, he's explaining that there's a kind of metaphysical theory behind the adequatio formula, right? But that formula can change, right? The Hegelian formula is not exactly the same as the scholastic formula, and the older tradition of thinking, as he puts it on 120, it doesn't yet have that full theological notion that you got on 118. And he doesn't tie it directly to idea either. But what's the point? The point is that he's not just showing one of these potential metaphysical theories, right? He's showing that this is a structure which is invariant across them, and he's trying to do that to show that there is a sense in which this adequatio notion can stand in for all of these different metaphysical understandings of the possible correspondence between the thought about the matter and the matter the thought is about, right? And it is typical of metaphysics to try to give you an explanation in terms of some imagined machinery about how the thing could work that makes it that allows for the possibility of this correspondence, right? But the thing that it is trying to allow for is something that can be in accord or out of accord from either side. There's either way in which there can be a match or a mismatch. When I say from either side, I mean from the side of the matter or from the side of the proposition, right? From either side of those, there can be a match or mismatch. And to me, the essential work that is doing here is not just to relate this to the history of philosophy and its variety, so that he can have a formula taken from scholasticism stand in for metaphysics as such and how it thinks about truth. But also he needed that material thing in here so he's not just talking about propositions. He doesn't want to just be talking about propositions and be talking about propositional logic and what it means to assert, right? In a way, some of that stuff all the way goes all the way back to Aristotle, but he's not giving you here a logical analysis of how the proposition manages to assert things which are or are not the case about things, right? There'll be a little bit of that in the section on the inner possibility of occurrence, but it still won't be a logical analysis of propositions. There's no doctrine here that it is only at the level of propositions that anything like truth or falseness becomes possible, which is a doctrine you get in Aristotle on the propositional side of this. Instead, you can have material genuineness or its absence, right? Which is, I think, importantly for him, before the level of the proposition, right?
Yeah, it seems to be the basis of metaphysics. I mean, even like the ancient Greek phrase, right, which is ta meta ta physica, what comes after the study of natural things or of the matter. So this phrase can be used in order to have us think about the order of things themselves. And,
so I'm going to slightly disagree with you there, because after the physics doesn't quite mean after the matter.
Right. Yeah.
But sure. Now, I think that Heidegger is correct that there is in the notion of idea that is shared across most of these, that there's a Platonism direct or residual in each of them, and that the basis of that is trying to do something like explain how a true understanding can happen. But I don't think he's certainly not elaborating here on why that would even be a problem or why you would need to have some explanation for it. The closest he gets is when he, in the coins example that Trevor was talking about, he raises the question about how anything like a statement can correspond to something about the thing when the statement is not a means of payment and it's not metallic and it's not in space. So how can it correspond to this coin, which is metallic in space and a means of payment, right? Obviously, when we say those things about it, we're not doing so metallically in space or as a means of payment, right? So, but he's appealing to this strangeness or slipperiness in the fact that anything like language can refer to matters that are the case rather than to words themselves. Sorry, Dan.
No, I was just trying to, like 2-3 years ago, we read that book on Plato, and there we have like Titus, and we have 3-4 types of truth, and then there appears the propositional truth, and Heidegger claims that's the crucial point when everything went downhill.
Well, you have to remember that in the Theaetetus, the claim that Socrates is arguing against is the claim that truth is purely a matter of perception, right? He only comes to the idea that there is a truth. It's not even that it's propositional, because it's actually right opinion is the alternative. That's the right opinion is where anything like proposition enters in Plato as opposed to in Aristotle. Aristotle's the one who only locates truth in the proposition. But in the Theaetetus, the thing that they're talking about is whether or not it is fundamentally perception or fundamentally right opinion, right? Or right opinion with an account, what you have to add to right opinion in order to make something knowledge. And that's particularly knowledge rather than truth that they're discussing. But the point is that it's not like the notion of something like a perceptibility or disclosure as a background of truth is something that Plato didn't consider. It's where he starts. The critique of the notion of truth as being fundamentally perception is the relativity of perception and the non-relativity of truth, something like that. In Plato, I mean, not necessarily here. But it's not the case that the perception angle isn't there in Plato, is the point I'm trying to get at. It's not simply focused on the proposition layer in Plato. Plato is not giving you a logical doctrine in the Theaetetus. Okay, but the point that I'm getting at here is there is a discussion of these different metaphysical positions about how adequation can happen, or this course coming into correspondence can happen. But in both cases, it is an agreement between, and this is the thing. What is the agreement between? Is it between the mind and the thing? That's the usual way it's stated in the scholastic formula, but it can also be between the statement and the thing. The statement and the mind are obviously not quite the same thing. Okay, so let's go on to 2 for a second, because this is where we're getting into the whole way in which there's a point that language does for him here, and it's not the same as the statement. So this is on 120 to 121, where he's talking about the inner possibility of accordance, and he says the statement never succeeds in relinquishing itself to become like the thing, right? And if it did, it wouldn't be able to come to correspondence. So the next question is, how does correspondence between the statement and the thing come about, and where can it come about? Okay, and this is on 121, where he says, as long as this relation remains undetermined, not grounded, all dispute over the possibility and impossibility of the nature and degree of the correspondence loses its way in the void. There needs to be something that can bring into commensurability of some kind or another, something about the matter that is the case with the thing, and something like the statement. Okay, that's the underlying issue or problem here. And instead of addressing this with some doctrine of predication or doctrine of reference or theory of intentionality about how terms refer, which you could easily have gotten from any preceding philosophy. Instead, what do we get? What we get is that disregarding all psychological preconceptions and any theory of consciousness, so he wants to throw that away, and he's talking about, you need to understand that this move is a phenomenal move. He's trying to go away from theories about how it might happen to just what the phenomena itself shows us. So it's important to notice this is a place where we're doing something phenomenal on the one hand and also something kind of neo-Kantian structural on the other. We're asking a condition of possibility question for something like this relatedness to occur. That's a very Kantian move, but we're also disregarding all theories about it in order to just look at the bare phenomena of what is related to here. And this is where you're doing some direct seeing phenomenology. And there's an appeal here to a direct intuition of the structure of the experience or the structure of the things you're trying to relate. Okay. To present here means to let a thing stand opposed as object. That's the underlying claim, right? And that is a claim about the structure of this attempt to relate these things at all. He says, as thus placed, what stands opposed must traverse an open field of opposedness while maintaining its stand as a thing. In other words, it doesn't become a thought, right? And show itself as something withstanding, something that stands. So already there we have, in this very tight formula, something which is saying that there is an open field of opposedness, which is treating something as an object, but it's not simply an object because the object would refer to something like the mental construct of what I intend. And we already have the earlier phenomenology, intentionality notion that no, we're actually not trying to talk about another one of my thoughts. We're trying to talk about the thing which my thoughts are about, right? We're trying to refer. And the way in which all of that is encapsulated here is just that there is a open field of opposedness. And the opposed there is the ob of object, right? Okay. There's a something which traverses a field of openness taking place within an open region. This is going to matter because that open region is where truth is. He's trying to tell you where something like truth can happen. And where something like truth can happen is in something like an open field of opposedness between anything the statement could be talking about and the thing that it's trying to refer to. Okay. So this is as compact a version of Husserlian intentionality updated to full Heideggerian opposedness as we get to an opened up as such. We'll get to the comportment that comes in between just a second. He says, but all comportment is distinguished by the fact that standing in the open region, it adheres to something opened up as such emphasized. What is thus opened up solely in the strict sense was experienced early in Western thinking as what is present for a long time has been named by being. This is meant to be almost definitional. What can stand opposed that is meant to be the thing that stands and is not meant to be merely something about one moment of my thought about it is what a being means. And in that sense, a being can be opened as such. And the can be opened as such is can stand opposed to the mind as the thing that it is the intentional object of its thought. Okay. Why does this matter? Because there are whole theories of philosophy that want to define being as to be thinkable. And you could look like that's going on here. It has to at least be able to stand as a possible standing in an open field of opposedness and over against. But he is not saying that makes it a projection like a Kantian might, an object like a Hegelian might, that it's simply an object of thought, right? There's an actual opening up to an actual domain of relatedness, so to speak. Okay.
Yeah,
and then
so
the relation.
Jason,
I'm sorry.
I would paraphrase this as in section 1, he was looking at beings and the truth in beings. Is this gold or is this a propositional truth about a thing, about a being, but now truth has moved from being about beings, which is all of metaphysics from Aristotle's metaphysics through to Hegel, to now truth is in this field.
So you're right that he's
the
eventually going to get there. He's going to eventually get to the fact that the structure of this open is has a greater claim to be called what truth is than the particular facts about the particular entities opened or revealed within it. That's true. But at this point, he is at first simply identifying the present opened up being as what we mean by being, right? This is definitely being without the why, right? Being without the why is going to refer to more. That's why he uses this, it is what is present and has long been called, right? Long been named, right? So he's not simply endorsing this, but he is saying this is the traditional understanding, right? Traditional understanding is the beings are that which open themselves up in this field of open opposedness, right? And that's going to be related to why the whole field of this is called Aletheia, the unconcealed, and also why the beings that were revealed there are going to be named fusus, arising presence. Where are they arising into presence? They're arising into presence in this open field of opposedness, right? So the point that I'm trying to make here is there is a critical thing that language is doing for him here. The need to tie to language was the reason why you go looking for anything truth-like in the space of these opposed meanings, right? These standing over against meanings and intentions. There's already something meaning-like about being itself, about beings themselves. And transposing into meaning space is a big part of the operation that is going on here. We get to the space of truth as the space of this open, as the space where meanings happens. And the claim is that's also the space where language tries to operate. Language is not simply a physical object in the material world. Language is trying to be about, and I say trying to be about because these are intentions, and whether or not they succeed is something philosophers will debate. But intentionally speaking, language is trying to be about this meaning space. Okay. So I think that this section is a great example of what Pete was talking about earlier, of this is incredibly compressed. If you don't know the ideas he's trying to link up here, it can be hard to see how he makes this leap from the inability of the apparent inability of the statement to be like the coin to the thing that the statement is actually saying being able to be about a meaning about the coin, its roundness, where they can completely correspond, right? Okay. This also relates to Josh's question about how much is this truth, this correctness left behind intact? Because at this level, it is possible for there to be such correspondence, right? In that meaning space, there can be correctness of statements, right? He's not relativizing all of them. He's not making them all illusions projected by the human mind or something like that, right? He's allowing in this space of meanings where language lives and where beings as intended standing opposed reside in meaning space, if you like, there is something like correctness. He's not denying that there is correctness there. Okay. So if you like, this is a different theory about how statements manage to refer, right? But the critical thing, and I think this is the point Pete was making, is that in giving his theory about how they manage to refer that we just went through, he's placing it in this idea of you have to have an open comportment to an open region where anything like this field of opposedness can occur. And this is pure neo-Kantian condition of possibility type reasoning. Meaning it's the kind of thing we were asking, what are the conditions of the possibility of this to occur? The conditions of the possibility of this to occur is there has to be an open comportment to have anything like relatedness to being occur, right? What does he mean by an open comportment? Okay, and this is where we talk about some of these things here, right? He gives you as a bearing. Verhalten is the comportment, and verhaltness is the bearing. But it is something accomplished there. What is the accomplished there? There is and this is a claim, that there is something like an already understood directedness from the comportment itself that the presentative judgment should try to conform to the being. The being is accepted as a standard by the comportment itself. The comportment itself is trying to reach the truth about the being, right? And that's why in the next section, he's going to ask his new questions. How can anything like a pre-established directive to comport in the manner of correctness occur? Where did this directive come from? How do people know that they're supposed to perform judgments according to an open being meaning that they are trying to relate to? This is very far from you just make it up in a way that is convenient to you, right? There is a subordination of the intention of the comportment to the truth it is trying to discover about the meaning that is open to it, right? And what he's asking is, how does anything like that occur? And it's not enough to just say, language is used to do this. It is a standard set over language as to when language can be correct or not. It can even have the possibility of being correct or not. Okay. So now this is a claim about the comportment, a comportment that has that intention, of being true to the beings as opened up, is an open comportment. Open why? Open because taking its directives from the matter that it is considering, taking its directive from the beings. This pre-givenness of a standard belongs to the openness of the comportment, he says. And then he says, since this is what allows statements to be correct or not at all, it's the actual ground of anything like the correctness of statements. So an open comportment to the meaning space of how the beings that unveil themselves actually appear, that, if you put it this way, subordinated, and he'll later say, letting beings be comportment, is at the basis of the possibility of truth. Okay. Pause there. Josh.
I wanted to linger a little bit on the connection between correctness and beings as present, the presentness of beings as beings.
Yes.
It seems to me that that presentness is presupposed by correctness, and so then I'm wondering in the direction of say the distinction between isness as a copula, as an assertion, and asness, seeing something as something, as a kind of a developed structure underlying isness.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he definitely says here that this meaning correspondence can only take place because the statement is making an as-of claim about the appearing being, not simply an is claim, right? He is definitely restricted this to all these presentations are such as. This is on 121, right? The such as has to do with the presenting and it's presented, right? So this is also, this can only be if beings present themselves along with the presentative statement so that the latter subordinate itself to the directive that it speak of beings such as they are. So this such asness projection, if you like, or reduction of complexity or dimensionality, if you like, this projection into the space of the sentence, right, is this such as business, right? It's a such as business in what the statement can be about, and it's a such as business in the directive of presentative speech to correspond with the such as of the things as they are. And he claims that that's part of the comportment itself, that it understands itself to have the directive that if it is going to present the meaning of the being, it has to do so conforming to the such ases of the being as they present.
What about the relation between the isness, that is to say, and identity? Are you suggesting that identity is not being is being contained within or included within the larger
These are fair questions, but he is going to, I think that he is going to get at all of those things when he goes onward beyond what is the directive that we are complying with and the such asness that we are securing in correct statements. He's going to take us through a notion of untruth to what that leaves out. And eventually he'll even have a notion of what it is to insist as opposed to exist in all this. And I think that is where anything like a qualification of any of this correctness comes in. I think at the level of the directive to presentative statements to comply with the such as that they receive in the beings, it is a extremely, if you put it this way, property-like essentialist, not existence-like or identity determining notion of the truth of statements, right? The truth of statements are always, put it this way, such as partial views. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that we need to appreciate that a distinction between how we approach correctness versus throwing in the concept of identity, that needs further, that he's going
or being and non-being, or disclosed or not disclosed. Exactly, right? There's going to be background of mystery behind all these things, but the things which are presented as they are presented are going to have truth as correctness predicable about them. All of the other critical aspects of the later part of the essay are absolutely all about all the stuff that leaves out. But we first have to understand that what he's claiming about how the revealing structure of the truths about the individual beings occurs in the foreground, so to speak, it's in line with what you would get from Husserl, the ideas, right? It's not trying to completely revise that for that surface showing of how the meaningful aspects of the being present to disclosive comportment. I hope that helps. These are great questions, by the way. Dan.
Yeah, going back to related to this on top of 122, and he said what is to open up only in this strict sense was experienced early in Western thinking as what is present and is called being. So I think what he's saying here, today we take this present, what's present as actual, as existent, and we never ask what's behind that. And he's saying that's something that was at some point open up, and it is we call it present, but it was open up at some point, and we forgot that, and this ties up with other topics that we'll discuss later.
Yes, there'll be a philosophical history of the achievement of any of this, but there's a apparent qualification at the end of that first half paragraph from 122 about for a long time it's only been named this, etc. But the next paragraph is in his own voice, and it is completely declarative, right? Comportment stands open to beings, not to appearances, not to illusions. Comportment stands open to beings, right? So man's open stance varies according to the kind of beings and the way of comportment, right? So there can be variety in that, but the fact that comportment is an open relation to beings is here not something he's ascribing to metaphysics or something he's ascribing to someone else. He's just saying this is actually how it is phenomenally happening, right? This is not something he is critiquing. This is in his own voice, right? And the following the directive to speak of beings such as they are, he's going to need that essentially to anchor his next moves into anything like freedom or untruth. So he cannot have any of this remain slippery or be put in doubt brackets of this is only the way metaphysics thinks about it. No, this is how he thinks about it. In this 122, the paragraph beginning with comportment stands open to beings. Okay.
And one more thing, I think for me, for example, personally, this issue of correspondence, and we went back, like how for example, the coin and the round come together and we make statements. And it seems to me that looking at how the entire history of philosophy tried to approach that, they were never able to solve it. They either try to collapse it at what end, or try to come around like Hegel did, or Kant did, or Berkeley did, and
so
try to.
Let us not make claims so extreme, because they all think that they have theories of it, right? So we're not going to try to critique every other philosophy in existence. They all
Saying
have
here
ways.
we need to step back and see that there is more.
I'm sorry. I think you had a voice problem, so I didn't catch all of you. I was saying that I don't want to go as extreme as claiming that no other philosophy has had its own correct theory about how any of this works, because they all obviously do have some theory about how this works. But the thing which I see as being distinctive to Heidegger here is this move to the prior requirement of the open comportment, and the fact that there is something like a pre-given directedness involved in that comportment itself. This is something which could be merely assumed in some other treatments, but assumed without being highlighted, without being noticed, and that means left out, right? It's an unthought in, say, how Aristotle understands truth as being a property of statements, that he already has this notion that of course speech must conform to what the beings reveal in whatever they say, but he's not saying that, right? And Heidegger is saying that. Okay. So open comportments that they can let themselves be assigned a standard is the key thing he has achieved from this. Well, there's two things. He's achieved that there is something like a necessity for an open comportment that lets itself be prescribed a standard. That's going to be what in the future becomes letting beings be, by the way. And we also, as Pete helpfully pointed out, have the notion that there is this open region of relatedness, and it's easy to fixate on the beings appearing in that open region and to not notice the open region itself, which is where we're going to get to some of the things about untruth and concealment and so on. Okay, that's just sign points of where we're going and why these aspects are coming out here. But the reason I'm going through this in this detail is this is a crucial point where he's switching from the traditional view of these things to what's going to be his own view of these things. I have to see how he unpacks all those. But to see the fulcrum and what it relies upon is important to assess Heidegger's philosophy itself. The fulcrum it's turning on is this issue of what's involved in anything like an open comportment that can get a directive to conform to the truth of the being in its presentative statements about it. And I put it to you, that's not what you get in Nietzsche, who's going to ask, why truth anyway, if it's not according to my human purposes, because there's a pre-given directedness here, which isn't like that at all, right? But it's also indebted to this phenomenological understanding of the ability of the mind to reach the objects that it intends. None of this is locked up inside the mind as subjectivists would be, right? Okay. We're about to go on to the parts where he's going to take this to the point of the notion of essence of truth is freedom on page 123. But I want to pause here for a second to give people a chance to ask questions about without worrying too much about where we're headed next. Is the step he's taken here and why he's taken it clear enough now for people that we can move on? I mean, it doesn't mean that we won't have to think about it more or go back over the tape, whatever, but is it clear enough here that we can move on? Without objection, it is so ordered. Okay. All right. So what we get in the very next section, where he's anchoring it back to something like a prior mandate that presentative statements have to conform to something, a pre-given directedness, as he calls it. How does that occur? And this is where he says, almost out of nowhere, The openness of comportment is, I'm sorry, is that, who's that, James, who has background noise?
Oh.
Who has the background noise? Sorry, whoever it was managed to mute. The essence of truth is freedom, but at the immediately preceding sentences, the openness of comportment as the inner condition of the possibility of correctness is grounded in freedom, right? He calls this a hitherto uncomprehended essence of freedom, so we shouldn't assume that we know what freedom means here for him, but he is trying to say here something like the essence of truth is freedom. And I just need to get first reactions to that claim. Did anyone who hadn't read this before see that coming? Or not see that coming? I want to comment on how much they did or didn't see it coming.
Didn't see it coming.
Did not see it coming.
Okay. And why do you think that it's there? What is this freedom he is talking about?
The essence of truth, so the essence of Aletheia.
Yeah, it's not yet, he's not yet saying Althea here. He's saying something like that there has to be some pre-given directedness that you ought or should, in all presentative statements, conform to the disclosed truth of things as they are revealed to you as the beings that they are. And that he's calling the fact that there is that pre-given directedness that you can experience as kind of an implicit norm over your judgments, something like that, that points to an essence of freedom. Why?
Essence of freedom, the essence of freedom, letting beings be. Essence of freedom.
He will get to that in the next chapter. You're correct. He's going to come out there, but I first need you to see why letting beings be as one of the possible modes or uses of freedom is relating all this to a freedom. Josh.
Well, I want to bring in the notion of transcendence here, that so letting beings be is transcending towards beings, and that's
Yes.
freedom.
Why is that freedom?
Because it is, I'm reluctant to use the word the new or novelty because that's, fraught with problems, but it
I think that you're partly right. I think what you're saying that, and you're partly right. I want to point out. Sorry. I'm sorry. Who has the? Someone tell me who has the one who's coming off mute and has background noise.
It's James.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We talk about novelty.
Yes. So there's the novelty concept, and there's also the fact that this is a kind of implicit directive. So there's two aspects of it. One is that although there is this directive for the comportment to be open, and therefore to take its standard from the received meaning, if I can put it that way, of the being, that is a directive that need not be complied with. A comportment does not need to be open. It can be, but it is possible for a comportment to be closed. This was also related to what he will talk later about insistence. But there is an element of this accepting the directiveness and complying with it, which has an element of it is what Kantian would regard as a moral standard, something like that. That it takes the kind of freedom to conform with. I'm sorry, I have to mute James there. The second, though, related to what you're saying, is this transcendent business, and I would put it as follows. Part of the essential freedom of Dasein is that Dasein is openly connected to an undetermined transcendent. So, and that's a deeper sense in which the essence of truth is freedom, right? The essence of truth is freedom because the truths themselves are not constrained by you. And openness to an unconstrained transcendent, to an unknown transcendent, to an undetermined, is a kind of undetermined oneself, even if it's a subordinate one, right?
Yeah. So
What-
that's an implicit, I'm sorry, that represents an implicit critique of metaphysical notions of the will and choice, right?
The former could be will and choice if that will has the option to close itself off to openness, but there's also a notion of receptivity of truth as being a not. Metaphysics is very inclined to regard truth as something completely unchanging and fixed, and to regard, and from Heidegger's point of view, that is missing, first of all, something essential about truth and the essence of truth, and second of all, something essential about openness. Part of the fundamental nature of openness is that it is directed by another, right? It is not a willfully self-directed. A willfully self-directed is not an open, it's a push. It is, in the terms of cosmic journey technology, a challenging revealing, so to speak, right? But an openness, to really be an openness, has the character of a listening. It has the character of a receiving. And openness to an unknown is an openness to a being determined in a new way, to get at your point about newness, right? So I would put it, part of the essential freedom of Dasein is that Dasein is openly coupled to an unknown. And something which is openly coupled to an unknown cannot be calculated.
And we can contrast this with Sartre's position on, freedom. Wouldn't you agree?
Right. Yes, because he wants freedom to all be about choice and self-direction, in part because he's in these terms much more of a traditional neo-Kantian who regards as, giving your autonomous command to yourself as the only way to be free, or something like that. That's not the kind of freedom that Heidegger is talking about here. It is precisely the taking over of a pre-given standard from the matter itself. Sorry, Nathan.
So is this kind of a different way of explicating like the relationship between authenticity and inauthenticity that he has in being in time, in the sense that you can kind of choose yourself or not? The kind of temporality that we have, I guess, as humans.
Partly so. He's not here referring to authenticity, but he is referring to openness. And you can think of authenticity as an openness to own most possibilities, as opposed to being lost in a day of other possibilities. But he's not here primarily making the contrast between own most and fallen or they. He's going to have a notion of fallen here, but it's going to be errancy, not inauthenticity. But we're not there yet. So it's not simply the same, if I go this way, existential morality here. It's not about selfness. It's about openness to truth. So good question, John.
The part of my question was what Nathan was going to ask, but again, this is back to terminology, and it seems almost provocative for him to use the word freedom. He's always happy to make up a word if he needs a new word for something, it seems to me. And freedom just is so loaded, kind of liberal, hyper subjective. Do you know what I mean?
You're absolutely right that he means this to be paradoxical. That the essence of truth is freedom is meant to be paradoxical. And you're right that he then goes on to, imagine a whole bunch of objecting people in the audience, right? Does this not submit truth to human caprice? And that's a wavering reed. And he ends all that with resistance to the proposition that the essence of truth is freedom is based upon preconceptions, the most obstinate of which is that freedom is a property of man. The essence of freedom neither needs or allows any further questioning. That means he's about to question it. Everyone knows what man is. He's claiming you don't, right? So he thinks of those objections as being based upon, if I can put it this way, dogmatic common sense understandings of what man is and what freedom is that he is about to undermine. He's going to claim that man's nature or essence resides more in the things he's now talking about here than in anything like the notion of a rational animal, for example. And he's also claiming that this is related to this openly connected to a transcendent. Freedom should not be thought of as a property of man, first of all. Man does have a notion of freedom, but it's an inherited and derived one, right? Man is free because man is a being that is open to being, right? And being is an unconstrained transcendent, right? So, and that's a very different notion from the subjectivist understanding of truth and spontaneity. There's an implicit critique of the subjectivist understanding here all through this later part of section 3, where he's imagining the objections to the subjectivist philosopher, and he's imagining that what the subjectivist philosopher's opinion is, or stance is that something like this: the human being is a free representational engine who can choose to represent anything at all, but it should abide by these rules of rationality and sense, or its representations will not manage to correspond to reality, right? So you imagine a freedom to use representational, imagination, something like that, in ways that could be, completely at variance with the truth, completely self-deluding, but only following the proper strictures for how one ought to think that are laid down by this or that philosophy or this or that logical doctrine will prevent the wavering read of the representational engine that could point anywhere at anything and completely lose itself from going off the rails.
It sounds like he's setting us up for attunement, like that's the thing that we can calibrate. Reading in?
Partly so, but he's violently disagreeing with that picture of human being, right? That picture of human being imagines that we're not already connected to a standard of truth outside of ourselves. It's imagining that we can only have a standard of truth if we make it, if we give ourselves the rules of right reasoning. In the case of, there's a quote from Kant at the end of the essay where he'll talk about philosophy or reason can only obey the laws that it gives to itself, something like that, right? But there is a notion in all of that the realm of subjective representation is a hopeless mass of confused error unless or until some stricture of reason, that can guide it to the right path is adhered to, right? And he's saying, no, the first important thing is to realize that truth is a matter of comportment to an outside yourself that you do not control and that is free, right? And this is beyond the attitude of wonder that you get in the Greeks. This is what he will later talk about as resolutely bearing the mystery, recognizing first of all, the very first thing about the universe that you were placed in is you do not understand it. And your only hope of understanding it is to be open to it and to listen, not to dictate to it, whether rules of rationality or any other kind. So that's kind of where we're headed. But the critical thing that's being said here is that the freedom he's pointing to is this coupling to an open coupling to a free transcendent. John, do you have more?
No, that was helpful. Thanks.
Okay, Josh.
Yeah, it occurred to me also that would you brought up the idea that this you can think also, in addition to this primordial notion of freedom, that we can give ourselves over to or let beings be, or we can choose not to let beings be. But this choice not to let beings be, it's interesting, if you think about maybe how Heidegger talks about that in terms of fallingness, in terms of errancy. But would you agree then that just as Heidegger talks about how even when we're ensconced within this everyday world of familiarity, that uncanniness is the more fundamental notion that's always at play or operative, even when it's being covered over or we are being forgetful of it, that this primordial freedom is always at play, even when it's being repressed or concealed.
I would agree with that. And I think that's Heidegger's position on it. We'll get to the various forms of lack of open comportment as we go along, but I'm going to mention just one of the most basic ones, right? You can experience the relationship that you have to the unveiled nature of the beings that you are about which you are trying to make presentative statements, as though it is an inconvenience standing in the way of you achieving your technological will, right? If you try to twist reality to get what you want from how other people receive your statements, you are not engaged in this open comportment that is listening to being, right? There may be 100 other ways, but the most basic one, the one that's at the basis of he mentions all the ways in which human being can be, deceit and dissimulation, lies and deception, illusion and semblance, all kinds of untruth can be ascribed to man. And there's going to be other things he's going to get to that he regards more fundamental than that, but that's one of them, right? All of that is possible as simply a distortion of this open comportment and a refusal to put the truth of the matter in charge of your presentative statements about it. If you put your own projects and will in charge instead of the nature of the thing that you are presenting about, or how it reveals itself to you as you have lights to see it, so to speak, then you're going to get all those kinds of semblance, right? That's not exhaustive. There's going to be more in other sections, but that's right there in 3. Sorry, John.
Sorry,
Is just your hand still up, or do you have another comment?
it's down.
Okay, Nathan.
Yeah, so for Heidegger, I guess because of the nature of the temporality, the kind of temporality that we have, being the thing that's the most, I don't know, like the deepest thing about us, even our freedom can only be, it's constrained by both our thrownness and our projection, right? So the horizon of possibilities that's open to us is still constrained in some way. So freedom is never anything kind of fully open or totally spontaneous. It's always constrained by the kind of temporality that we have. Is that like close?
And by a lot more than that, but we're going to get to freedom and history in 4. Yes, we're steering towards the history comes in here, even before temporality. History comes in here after he's talked about freedom as letting things be, in contrast to fusus, in contrast to the realm of nature, right? So he's already going to tell you that there's something about man's being in history which is different from just another realm of nature, another portion of the realm of physics, right? So the point that I'm getting at is something like history and even the history of man's relation to being, or the disclosureness of what is, right? All of that is gonna come in the next section. But before we even get there, and we're not talking about thrownness yet or anything like that, before we even get there, there is just this basic attunement matter and this basic understanding that the open comportment that receives a pre-given directedness is itself a put it this way, a positive and narrow thing. He's not saying that means that it always results in that in objective truth. That's not the kind of claim being made here. He doesn't say, he's not saying that means that there's no thrownness behind it, nothing like it. But one of the ways in which untruth can happen as semblance is simply not abiding by that directive, right? And mankind is free to not abide by that directive. Whole civilizations are free to not abide by that directive. Dan?
Yeah, I think he's already hinting at history when he mentioned their metaphysics. He already mentioned that, which says metaphysics regards such truths as imperishable, internal. And he said that's not the dimension. On one hand, we have this imperishable and eternal truths, and on the other hand, we have human caprice, and we try to find freedom somewhere there, and so it's not there. And I think he's preparing kind of the ground for history, where we have this dimension of, we can, I guess, better see this dimension of freedom.
You're right, but this is mostly a contrast to a right. You're correct that it's a metaphysical, but it's even presented as almost commonsensical, as well as metaphysical view that everything which is human and subjective is unstable and changing and unreliable, and everything which is objective outside, not non-man is stable, eternal, and true. And the point that he's making is not what he's making many points. One of the points he'd be making about that is that there is a directive to let beings be and take the directive from the things themselves involved in that which has its truth. But it is untrue that the thing that it is coupled to is unchanging. The thing that is coupled to is unknown. And therefore it cannot be constrained to never change. Nathan? Sorry, Nathan, do you still have your hand up, or?
Yeah, sorry, my hand was up from before. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So, but you're right to bring up the imperishable and eternal as the thing which metaphysics wants to. The reason that metaphysics wants truth to be something objective is because it thinks the objective can be not subject to the winds of change that it locates inside the subjectivity, right? And if Heidegger has a point here, it's not one point, but one of the points here is that it is not true that all change is located inside the subjectivity, not even remotely. Okay. All right. So we got now to the essence of freedom as letting beings be. This is in section 4, right? And this is taking us to Aletheia, the Da, and fusus. So this is another compact set of things which where we're definitely in, I put it this way, we're moving towards Dasein, we're moving towards Heidegger doctrine, but we're also staying close to what he reads as being the original unveiling of being in the Greeks, right? Nathan?
Yeah, sorry, just before. So is he saying that freedom is something that pertains to being itself and not just Dasein? I mean,
yes.
Okay.
The right way of putting this is that freedom is not directly or simply a property of human being, but freedom is human freedom is based upon the fact that the human being as existent, as outside of itself, as pointing beyond itself, as related to being, is open to an unconstrained transcendental. Right?
Got it.
Okay.
Cool.
I think he's going to say later that it's not freedom under our control, but rather we are under freedom's control or something like that.
Yes, he says that freedom has us. That's the way he puts it, rather than we have freedom. Right? He says freedom is engagement in the disclosure of beings as such, discloses itself as conserved and existent engagement, through which the open is the open region, i.e. the there, Da, is what it is. So what's the point here? He's giving you a definition of Dasein. He's giving you in this short formulation here on 126, he's explaining to you what he means by Dasein, and he doesn't just mean the beings as the kind of being that we have, like he did at the beginning of being in time. The definitional form is, it is this existent engagement in the open region. Existent meaning beyond itself, right? This opened to the outside, and Dasein, critically understand the sign part, is a form of being. It's not just a form of consciousness. It's not just a subjectivity. It's not locked up inside of a head. It is a form of being. It is the form of being that has this disclosuredness of the place or site where disclosure occurs. So this is very critical to understanding what all this is going at. He told you that the essence of truth depended upon this free opposedness in an open region. He's now going to tell you that the structure of that open region, the openness and the open structure of that open region, is existence, is Dasein, and that is something that has man.
I not understand, Jason.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That when I said that freedom is letting beings be,
Yes.
be. And you said no, yes, that is, we will get to that, you said, but
We're
there's
there now, yes.
also, yeah, we're there now. But do I not understand, as someone mentioned, or am I not wrong? Am I wrong in thinking that there are two aspects of freedom? One is letting beings be, letting beings be, and the other is comes or is an aspect from Dasein, which you just nicely said that Dasein is also a being. That's very nice.
Yes.
I'm glad
Yes.
you said that.
Yes.
But Dasein has to be free in to be able to not impose to be able to think in a way that is not imposing its thinking into being. So isn't that then, does not freedom in some way also have this dual nature to it?
So you're mostly right. I mean, the way he puts it is that this letting beings be is a form of engagement. It's active. It is an active letting, so to speak. It is not a merely receptive ignoring it letting. It is an active letting things be, and that engages the freedom to have not done so. That engages the freedom to have not let beings be, or for that matter, not attended to them, not been engaged with them. So attentive engagement to letting beings be is an activity, and to act in that way is part of the freedom of Dasein. But again, he uses the word fulfillment at times, right? It is the fulfillment or enactment of a capacity, if I could put it that way. There is a structurally possible capacity, which is sometimes engaged and sometimes not, to be the place or site where the revealing of being occurs, right? And when Dasein is comporting itself in the open manner that it is receptive and taking the directive from the beings that it encounters to receive them, so to speak, in the letting beings be manner, then we have that openness of the comportment. We have the fulfillment of the ideal potentiality of Dasein, right? But Dasein can also remain closed off. Dasein has all kinds of ways of running from that possibility of its nature. John?
This is another naive question, but when he refers to open region,
yes,
outside, I run into the same kind of problems I did with basic problems when Kant is referring to absolute position. I'm
yes,
wondering where in the world how do I
yes,
picture the open region? I know it's a
yes,
metaphor, but how do you
yes.
visualize it, or do you visualize it? Is it a diagram on a blackboard?
It is
Is
not a
it,
diagram in a blackboard.
no, I mean, is it some
No,
fuzzy space?
these are perfectly fair questions. But
Okay.
this is why, when he's trying to describe it, the activity here, he describes it as an attempt to think from the perspective of Dasein and an attempt to transpose ourselves into Dasein. And what that means is that the only way to envision the open region that he is describing is to realize you live in it. It's the only way you'll ever see it.
It's not like the backdrop that I'm looking at behind you.
It is not like the backdrop. It is more like it is, yes, like the space that Kant was trying to think about confusedly as absolute position without knowing where it is. It is where all of the facts that are the case at the start of the Tractatus are located. It is not a point on the earth. It is the background of world in the structure of being and time, the always already there that you are oriented in even when your eyes are closed, the sight of the happening or appearing of truth. It is all these things, but the only way to be able to phenomenally investigate its characteristics, as opposed to reading about it as words on a page, is to go live there. Does that help?
Yes, sir.
I
Thank you.
realize this is hard. This is why
Well,
philosophies are all
actually, what's weird
experimental.
about it is that I'm resisting it, turning it into poetry or something,
Yes, it is poetry. There's no getting around it. That's why he likes
Okay.
poets. And there are people who are, in contrasting him with Hegel, will say where Hegel is logic, Heidegger on this subject is poetry. But yes, that's not unfair. But again, these are things that if you have a little bit of phenomenological training, even from earlier phenomenologists who are less focused on the moody and more focused on the clinically exact observational, like Husserl, you can already train yourself in this regard. But he is expecting you to engage all the elements of attunement, all the things that you know. Some of these there are some passages in Heidegger that are very good at conveying this sense. My favorite is probably the section about the standing before the tree in bloom in the What is Called Thinking, where he tells you that there's all kinds of things about that experience that you know are the case, and that various metaphysical and scientific doctrines are trying to convince you are illusions, but you know they're not. That's what I mean by going to live there. I don't know if that helps, but.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Okay, Dan.
Yeah, connected with John's question and also with people who are familiar with being in time, what's the relationship between open space and open comportment or open space and time there? Is it the same? Is it a new take on the same? It's a replacement?
The ecstasies of time are going to be structures discovered about the open region, but they're structures within it from this point of view. The open region is not yet determined as to its time moments, so to speak. But when we start asking ourselves, how does being essentially occur, then the time moments will come to the forefront, right? And that's a little bit like saying, okay, now that we've transposed into Dasein and we're living there, what do we notice about the nature of where we are? This essay is trying to tell us the most basic facts about that, where we are, not in the terms like being in the world or fallenness or thrownness of being in time, but in terms of things like the mystery, the errancy, and yeah, fundamentally, Aletheia, the mystery and the errancy. And yes, there's poetry in those, but by the time we get to the end of it, you'll see some of the ways in which this is related, not simply to the phenomenal time of Dasein, but also the historical time of history of philosophy, which is where this errancy stuff is going to tie in. But okay, we're as usual, now that we've made it past the turn and we're into the Heideggerian parts, we are zooming ahead, and things which are way later in the book or even outside this particular text are radiating into what we're trying to talk about in order to try to help us take the next step without losing the trail. And I understand that, but I want to talk a little bit about Aletheia and fusus, and why Aletheia and fusus. So the claim here in section 4, effectively, is that the Greeks had an understanding of this open region where beings arise and appear, such that anything like truth about them can occur, and such that there can be a pre-given directedness to comport presentative statements to them, right? To take directives from them, to be compliantly letting beings be with respect to that open region. And his claim is that the Greek term for this is aletheia, usually translated as truth, but really meaning unconcealed, unconcealedness. And this is going to be very important for the next sections. But the point is that the realm of this sight of appearing of truth that the Greeks immediately experience is the unconcealed. They understand the beings as the unconcealed, and they do this operation, which is its typical metaphysical operation, which is to ask for the common of the generalization. They want not just a being, they want beings as such. And beings as such means they want to know what is common across all these meaningful appearing beings. And what is common across all these meaningful appearing beings is they are disclosed. They are unconcealed. They arise and shine forth, right? Their meanings are apparent to and directive for Dasein and presentative judgment and correctness. the realm of beings as such as what arises and appears in the unconcealed. The word for that in Greek, according to Heidegger, is fusus, from which we get physics, from which we get nature. The realm of nature is what appears of itself, what arises and appears on its own. That is the realm of meaningful being. It is a word for what, it is word for the being of beings to Heidegger. The place in which
Aren't
that
we
arising and
missing?
appearing, go ahead.
I'm sorry, aren't we missing one portion though? It's what rises and appears. What about endures?
You're right that there is an enduring aspect to it. It has to have this persisting aspect. It has a presence and a persistence. There is even a focus on its persistence in the Greeks that Heidegger emphasizes. He's going to contrast that with some of his own understandings of these things. But the first point is that there is a immediate intuitive experience of the realm of truth as a place where Dasein exists in the Greeks, already in the pre-Socratics, as their experience of nature as arising, appearing, their appearance of nature as the shining, what shines forth of itself, and their understanding of the truths that they can determine about that as what stands forth into unconcealment. And to get one's directives from what not only what judgment should do, but for the highest purposes of human life from that unconcealment is the Greek way of experiencing being for Heidegger. When we get to the basic questions of philosophy, there'll be a whole section at the end about wonder as the fundamental comportment involved in this experience of nature, right? But that isn't here in this essay yet. But wonder before the self-arising, the self-appearing into the unconcealed, all of that is a paradigm of the open comportment for Heidegger. And it's critical to understand that. He is not critical of that. He is not denigrating that. He is not saying saying that is closed off or something. It is an example of the open comportment. It will have its own metaphysical limitations in terms of what it is trying to think about that we can get to along the way. But there is an awareness of the open region itself in the Greek fusus and in the Greek Aletheia. Josh.
Yeah, I would to articulate the beings in terms of well, it's articulating them with on the basis of a certain thinking of temporality, in which you talk about say a becoming in terms of something arising, approaching, perhaps persisting, and then decaying. That, in other words, the successive flowing of things, of the now out of the not yet into the no longer now. That's the notion of time as sort of persisting, as passing, but it would seem to me that that's a representational notion of time.
Yeah, they're not.
Arising.
He's not.
Yeah.
He's not yet at any notion of time involved in this. We'll get to the history he wants to tie this to in just a second, but he's not giving you a gloss on the Anaximander fragment here, right? He's just trying to explain he's trying to tie the poetic freight of fusus and the poetic freight of Aletheia to what he is talking about here as the open region. And that means he is also identifying the entire history of a civilization founded on the philosophy based upon that experience of the Greeks as the investigations of the truths of nature. That is its mission. That is the mission that it received when the open region was experienced as fusus, and the open and the directive is to unconceal it. Mr. Doyle, I'm sorry, Doyle.
Yeah, and this unconcealing, right? This open region that we're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, and this as he put it, this upsurgent presence, right, that happens by way of the Aletheia you know, this
Sturgeon's presence
unconcealment.
is basically, that's basically what the literal meaning of fusus is.
Yeah. And
Right.
and so I guess my point is, can this be described in a, I mean, it was tied back to the ancient Greeks, right? This immediacy in nature. Like, so this unconcealment is immediate at all times?
It's not making a claim about all times, and
Yeah.
it's not even primarily a claim about immediacy. The claim is this is an attempt to bring to language, to articulate a meaning of beings as a whole. Right? This is at the start of 127. The primordial disclosure of being as a whole, the question concerning beings as such, and the beginning of Western history are the same. Right? So the attempt to disclose the meaning of beings as such, the fundamental question of metaphysics from the Greeks, this trying to name that disclosure as Aletheia, the trying to name the what is disclosed as the fusus of self-arising, self-appearing. He's saying that the philosophical project that gets its impetus from that initial disclosure and that attempt to capture what is general in it founds Western history. And he's going to make the claim about history as opposed to physics, history as opposed to nature. What's different about history as opposed to nature is in history, events like such primordial disclosures occur. The history of the truth of being has a history. The unveiling of being in Dasein is not all at once, and it's not for all times. It has a history, and in that history, this fusus aletheia primordial disclosure has the status of the first beginning of an attempt to not just understand being, but articulate, bring to language an understanding of being as such. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and this is, you get further on 127 where he says, in a way that may sound strange to modern ears, right? Only existent man is historical. Nature has no history. He's not claiming there's no such thing as natural history. He's saying that the history he is talking about here is the history of this disclosure of being, the history of this disclosure, where we're talking about the disclosure not of an individual being experienced, but of the nature of being itself, the essence of being itself. Okay, that doesn't have that does have a history in a way that the particular truths of nature do not, which is not to say the particular truths of nature don't have the history of discovery. They absolutely do, right? But they don't have this the same living dependence upon their enactment in the site called Dasein, right? Historical events do. Historical events have this dependence upon the actual history of man's existence, the history of human comportments, right? Okay. So this is about bottom 127. That man exists now means that for the historical humanity, the history of his essential possibilities conserved in the disclosure of beings as a whole. The rare and simple decisions of history arise from the way the original essence of truth essentially unfolds. There's a giant claim here. The claim is the most important events in history are changes in man's relation to truth. Right? Discover philosophy in the Greeks, understand the idea of physics and Aletheia truth, unconcealment truth, and you will launch Western history. Okay. And that does mean that when he thinks that when we're probing these questions of what is not even proper, what is the essence of truth, and how does the essence of truth appear to man, and what do we know of the essence of truth and what we don't know of the essence of truth, that's the place where the fundamental simple decisions that drive the biggest forces in history occur. History is about the history of the disclosure of being or the disclosure of truth. Okay. All right, and there we get this thing of, because the essence of truth is freedom, historical man can let beings also not let beings if they are, they can be covered up and distorted, and semblance can come to power, right? Therefore, truth is not a property of man, but man can be used. I would say man can be used by the truth. Okay. So he claims there that truth and untruth are not irrelevant to each other. He's mentioned along the way several straw men of various ways in which people would think that the untruth is inessential here. But instead, we're going to get this notion that the letting beings be unveiling or its absence, these are the essential events in history. Okay. Now we're about to get to the mystery. Okay. This is on 129. We're getting to concealment. So before we even get to mystery, there is, well, not before we get to it, this is how we get to mystery. The claim is that disclosure of truth happens out of unconcealment. If you want to understand Althea, Althea is discovery. It means the thing was covered. It is disclosedness. It means it was closed and it was undisclosed. Right. There's the notion is there in the English as well as in the Greek that there is a background of coveredness. There's a background of the concealed, and that all unconcealment is out of the concealed. Why is he stressing this? The critical point here is that when you see the open region and you see truth as unveiledness rather than correctness of statements, you can notice the fact that the opposite of truth is not an untrue assertion. The opposite of truth is untruth as lack of disclosure, the hidden as such. Before untruth means I said something which isn't true, untruth means the oblivion of unconscious unknowing. It means that, as you're going to get to in a little bit, the mystery, the prior background of the unknown as such. And the claim that he's making here is that this is, if we put it this way, an existential structure, not an historical accident. Just as man is always thrown into his existence, he is always already in the mystery, right? And he talks about various means of evading this. The most prominent of which is to view the bits of unknown as tiny little islands of not yet known over which we can put a research program of the method that will eventually conquer them in a sea of knowns, so that we try to live our whole life in explored territory. And even talks about pushing out the limits of explored territory according to the directives that we have from the explored part. From Heidegger's point of view, these are all attempts to live in a reduced whole of the known, right? And the attempt to live in a reduced whole of the known is an attempt to evade the background of mystery. And it is part of the essence of truth that the background of mystery is always there, and it's what's sending all the directives to do discovery, right? Anyone who thinks that everything is known, anyone who thinks that almost everything is known and only a few things are left to be known, anyone who thinks that the things which aren't known can be conquered by a research program which will put them on a timeline and eventually know about them, any such view is denial of the mystery. And it is a form of oblivion of the essence of truth. It's denying the unconcealment nature behind things. John.
So in basic problems, I think there's a brief mention of Meister Eckhart and the nothing.
Yes.
Is this got any bearing on relationship to that? Negative theology?
Not quite, because in Eckhart wants the nothing to be something which is something he's putting higher than a being, as something that's more like even an other than the one. There's a whole tradition of the Neo-Platonists for whom there's various names of God, and the least misleading of them is nothing, is something you get in Dionysus the Areopagite, for example, that Meister Eckhart just takes over whole, right? But that's not the same thing as I think that Heidegger is trying to say here. Heidegger is trying to say that it is not an ineffable Godhead that is unknown. He's trying to say it is the entire continent of truth that is a jutting forth of tiny islands in a background submerged, concealed. The fundamental nature of the human situation where Dasein exists is in the mystery. And truth only occurs as disclosure as out of that background of the mystery, right? So this is not a mysteriousness of some particular object, which because of its unusually infinite nature cannot be fully known. This is a claim about the basic situation of Dasein as such. I would go further and say, you will not understand the structure of Dasein if you do not know that in its very being and structure, it always already knows that it is located in a mystery. That is why it has all the capabilities, all of the openness, all the compartments, all the attunings, and all the instincts that it has, right? If you just want to put on an evolutionary biologist hat for a second, right? You would not get finite embodied minds in a purely calculable world where they already knew almost everything. We are information scavengers because we exist in mystery. We are, any sphere of explored territory is always a tiny little bubble surrounded by the mystery of the rest of nature and the rest of history for that matter. Okay, so the point is there is this background of concealment, and that's the end of 5 where he says, letting be is intrinsically at the same time in concealing, and the existent freedom of Dasein and concealing of being as a whole appropriates is how it's comes to pass, brings itself to pass. Here there is concealment. What's the point of this? The point of this is that what appears as being and truth in the foreground tends to conceal the background of the concealment out of which that arose. The open region itself, the structure of the open region, the focus on the unconcealed out of which truth arises as background, all of those are part of the structure of truth. Okay. He says concealment preserves what is most proper to Aletheia as its own. Why does he say that? Because Aletheia cannot be Aletheia without lethe, right? You can't have the privative without the thing of which there is the privative, right? So there is a concealment of beings as such, as a whole, right? And then on 131, he's talking about how, however, man clings to what is readily available and controllable. He takes his directives from the seer of readily available intentions and needs, right? So this is what he calls the forgottenness of the mystery. Okay. And this is at the end of 132, end of 6, where he's getting at this notion of insistence. I'm sorry, Doyle, before I go farther.
Yeah,
Question?
I just wanted to go back over the readily available here.
Sure.
And how man would cling to that. I mean, does
Yes.
that constitute the pretty much the absolute majority of human life is just clinging to the readily available?
I don't know that it's the majority of human life. It's certainly the majority of human everydayness is Dasein, for the most part, gets the contents of its life from the beings with which it is engaged, and those are usually the things which are familiar and with which it is dealing with in a operational, practical manner. And even where it avoids doing that authentically, it is usually doing so less than consciously in the way that everyone else does, right? All that's the structures of everydayness we got in being and time. But the claim here of clinging to the revealed goes way beyond that everydayness. This includes the historians, this includes the scientists, right? This includes the positivist philosophers who know that to be is to be intelligible, right? So he's making a claim which is far broader than that. It's more like a claim that there is a ever-present drive in humanity to take what is the explored territory or the city and to mentally push it to the horizon and deny the outside, deny that there is an outside. I would put it to you that from Heidegger's point of view, the end of metaphysics, the characteristic positions at the end of metaphysics of Hegel and Nietzsche are to him paradigm examples of this. Hegel, by trying to reduce all of the real to the rational and to pretend that, essential philosophy has come to an end because it has been concluded, because we now understand that all the things we thought of as nature are only our own objects of consciousness that only seem alienated from us before we understand them as concepts. But in fact, we live in the world of our concepts, right? That's a Hegelian position that takes a version of explored territory and pushes it to the horizon, right? Or Nietzsche is going to leave a little bit of a background of mystery for it, but he's going to say the operational world for us is always the world as it appears to the inside, which is the world of will to power and our drives. He may acknowledge that those drives have some fundamentally mysterious character for the conscious willing subject, but at the level of those drives, that's all there is. And truth is the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, right? And there are only our purposes or the purposes of the will that is deeper than us, right, acting through us. But all of those are, in that case, it is not the city, it is life that is pushed to the horizon. The living as such is made the standard of being. Isabel, question?
Yes, I have an observation and a question, and I am puzzled.
Sure.
Aletheia
Yes.
is revealing. So Aletheia is concealment, and Aletheia is
Aletheia is unconcealment. Lethe is concealment or
conceal.
forgetting or oblivion.
That's exactly what my question. But are we talking then? You seem to mix them nicely, concealment and unforgetting. But aren't we and forgetting? Are concealment and forgetting? We are mixing oblivion. Are we not also mixing here two agencies? Let's say concealment is being chooses to conceal itself and then conceal its concealment, ergo the mystery. But Dasein, then, Dasein, the agency of Dasein, is it not the oblivion? Because doesn't Lethe mean also oblivion? Thank you.
So it's a fair question, but oblivion properly doesn't have an agency attached to it. There are times when he speaks of oblivion as something which transpires when Dasein loses its openness in its relation to being, something like that. But he's not particularly calling that a agency accomplishment of Dasein itself. Oblivion properly just means the never arisen into a world. The term that later Heidegger uses to describe this relationship between unconcealment and concealment is world and earth, where all the contents of the world, including its absences, its meaningful absences, its background structure, its horizon, its temporality, all of that, he calls world. But behind world, there is earth. There is the undisclosed under the disclosed, right? But that is not simply an agency of being. As for does the concealment of conceal itself? In this essay, he's describing part of the concealment as being an errancy inattention of insistent Dasein. When Dasein insists on the revealed, it misses the concealment. It misses the full structure of truth, and it only notices the discovered country, so to speak, not the background of mystery from which it was discovered or the background of mystery that remains, or it minimizes what that mystery is. So in that sense, he is here saying that there's a form of the concealing of the concealment, the missing of the concealment, that is not simply beings doing, but is done in part by man. And the term he uses in the second to last section for what that version of missing concealment is errancy. Errancy is the structure that describes in a historical period in which Dasein insists on the known to the point of denying that the unknown is anything more than a residual or conquered in principle, but not yet conquered in practice, something like that. And that structure is exactly what he's calling errancy. I don't know if that helps, but Josh?
Yeah, this gives me an opportunity to bring it back to, my initial, one of the issues that I wanted to initially focus on here. So let me start with, so wrapped up in that mystery, wrapped up in that, what's wrapped up in implied in freedom and in transcendence, I want to understand a little bit deeper in how this relates to attunement understood in terms of affectivity, because this is crucial because, you brought up Nietzsche and the distinction between Heidegger and Nietzsche here. So, for Nietzsche, affectivity is what grounds reason, so reason is sort of, it has an irrationality to it or underlying it. Sure. Because it is grounded in sort of relations of value, and value relations are grounded in affective drives. Which means that for Nietzsche, so when you bring up the question of, for example, objective aims of science, so one could say, so when it comes to the issue of a future of science, you say, well, these are science's accomplishments, or this particular science or that particular science. And now, if you think of it in terms of Heidegger's notion, say, of the mystery, right, and how it's open, the transcendence means it's open. It's not constrained by what has already been accomplished, say, within a science. But the question then is, to what extent do we understand value and affect in a radical way, such that what's put into question is the past of the science's accomplishments, such that there's a need to put into question everything that the sciences have ever accomplished in their past, because the future, that is, the mystery, implies that there will be ways of understanding ourselves and ways of understanding our science, such that, in a sense, we start over again on a different valuative basis. And so, just to wrap this up, so then a distinction, perhaps, and maybe you can clarify this, between Nietzsche and Heidegger would be that, eternal return of the same, at least as it's interpreted by, Nietzscheans like, Foucault and Deleuze, indicate it's an eternal return of the always different. So it's always differences differentiating from themselves, and there's never anything to get back to. There's never any stable basis, because it's everything. Everything in the world is continuously being, transcending itself anew. And so perhaps that there's an important distinction there between Nietzsche and Heidegger, where Heidegger, when he talks about, say, the difference between a particular way, a particular comportment toward the world, that those comportments have a certain temporary stability about them. That is to say, the mystery implies that they will undergo change, but that Heidegger does not want to say what Nietzsche does, this sort of radical notion of eternal return of the difference, where it's just differences continually changing other differences, and there's never anything. There's no stability of identity there, even temporary.
I think I what you're saying at, but I think I understand what you're getting at, rather. Obviously, we're going to have different interpretations of Nietzsche too, but in my reading, Nietzsche has a kind of metaphysical stability to him that is, despite trying to be open to various forms of change, he thinks that all of this will be will to power like, that all of this is something which is drive like. So there is an underlying notion in Nietzsche that something like a certainly not rational, certainly not conscious, but still there's a life that is behind all this, right? And the eternal return of the same is a way of the will's overcoming a limitation of will in the rearward willing direction, so to speak. It is a most sublime form of will to power. It is a desire of some aspect of will to conquer time in a certain sense. And in that sense, it is not something which is endlessly changing. It is a structure that is there across all of the changes. But this is one of the reasons that Heidegger regards Nietzsche as not an overturning of metaphysics, but a culmination of metaphysics. And that's something people can dispute with Heidegger freely. I happen to think he's right about that. I would go further, and I think that the Nietzschean understanding of value is very far from this taking directives from an open comportment notion that Heidegger is getting at, and the letting beings be notion that Heidegger is getting at from, I think, from my standpoint, not from Heidegger's, but informed by Heidegger. Nietzschean values are technological instruments for the governing of man's conduct. They are tools used to chisel the future of mankind into the shape of Superman, something like that. And as such, his attitude towards them is instrumental. It is instrumental reason. Reason has been turned into solely a tool of the drives. And from Heidegger's point of view, this means that any connection of that, go put it this way, intellectual and spiritual and poetical side of human activity to anything like a serving of the appearing of truth is gone. And Heidegger predicts that man who exalts himself to Lord of the earth in that fashion will be reduced to mere raw material. That is the direct prediction of questions concerning technology about what will happen to man who so exalts himself. And I put it to you that this doesn't seem to be off. But that's my own reading of Nietzsche that I'm sure we'll disagree about.
Yeah, well, I agree with that's Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, and I think it was probably not a good idea for me to bring that up. It was the first part of what I was saying was really more important to me, which is, I don't know if that made sense to you, that if I can put it in different terms very quickly, that with regard to stable ethics underlying scientific objectivity. When I say ethics, I mean an ethic of perhaps an ethic of progress, an ethic of validation. What remains and what needs to be rethought on the basis.
So it's a fair question, and I think that there is such an ethic in Heidegger, and that it is something like the letting things be of holding yourself open to being as smart as you can. I think the place where we see that is in our reading, at least, is at the end of 7, where he talks about letting beings as such be as a whole occurs in a way befitting its essence only when from time to time it gets taken up into its primordial essence. Then resolute openness towards the mystery is underway into errancy as such. Then the question of the essence of truth gets asked more originally. I put it to you that that is what he claims to be doing here, right? He is not simply noting these historical structures. He is making the accurate, open, the open comportment adhering to what the beings themselves announce about that history itself into the almost intellectually moral object of his endeavor and thought, right? He is trying to accurately describe how something like errancy occurs. And the accuracy of that description is what the matter itself says. It is exactly this open comportment thing, but he is exercising it at the level of the meta history, if you get me. He's trying to show us the structures of how being essentially occurs and how truth essentially occurs as they appear to him, knowing that that is happening at a particular historical conjuncture at the end of metaphysics. But he is trying to show that as a means of resolute openness towards the mystery. And from his point of view, resolute openness towards the mystery means not denying the mystery exists, not thinking that you're conquering it by acknowledging it, right? But a resolute openness to it is reading what is disclosed and what remains concealed as the beings announce themselves. And from Heidegger's point, I think from Heidegger's point of view, that there is a not just a personal, activity aspect of that for him, but there is a man's highest calling aspect of that to him, that there is a to be the shepherd of being, to be the place or site where being is revealed, to investigate the question of truth more closely at these turning points in history, are linked, right? The reason he's talking about the possibility of another beginning in Western history since the investigation of fusus since the Greeks is because he thinks that investigation of fusus since the Greeks has closed itself. It has finished itself in people like Hegel and Nietzsche and later technological civilization, but that leaves questions remaining. It leaves matters for thought remaining, and those matters of thought remaining are all about this essential history rather than nature, and this openness to being rather than the being of beings, being with a Y, being how it essentially occurs, which is what he thinks he's describing here. The last contrast I would think he's making here is, at the beginning, we were looking for a essence of truth that would be a common thing across truths because we were thinking platonically. By the end of this, he's trying to show you that a sketch of a single historical, what is the case, actuality is where to look for an actual essence of truth. I want you to notice the change in number. He's not looking for something which is true of every truth. He's looking for the single thing that is most importantly true about truth. And he's treating that as it's an historical thing. It is a one, not a many. It is unique. It is a unique question. It has the nature of a question because it's happening in a mystery. All of that shift to the one historical happening that matters most and is here now is a fundamental change of place and scope of human activity to looking for a universal that we accrue across the entire class and across all time, that the Greeks were looking for because they were on a mission to understand nature. Heidegger's on a mission to understand being and the structures of being, and there is still a generality to that, but the history of being is something that happens once. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I've almost gotten to the end of what I wanted to get to. I want to get to the formula of the reversal of the essence of truth becoming the truth of essence, because I realize that it's one of these places where the paradox can seem shallowly incomprehensible for all the reasons that Pete laid out at the beginning, right? So the original question of the essence of truth was about the whatness of a characteristic of knowledge. When he says that the formula for the reversal of that is the essence of truth is the truth of essence. The second part, the truth of essence, means the aletheia, the unveiling, the disclosure of, and the second part, essence, is to be read as being with a Y. How does being essentially occur? If we understand being now as something like the you have to take that whole open region where disclosure and concealing happens, where mystery reigns and errancy can occur or can be withstood resolutely. Take all of that and embed it in the history of it actually happening and happening once, making it alive and temporal in that sense, unconstrained because coupled to a free transcendent, and therefore not calculable as to its future. That structure, he is saying, that is how being reveals itself. And the claim is that you can answer a question about the essence of truth by telling people how being reveals itself, because that is what the question of the essence of truth is actually trying to ask, he's going to claim. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but I'm trying to explain why he gives you a formula like the essence of truth is a truth of essence. The second part of that sentence is not using the words in the same way they're using in the first part of the sentence, and he'll tell you that himself. The hard part is to understand how he's using the second half of the sentence. In the second half of the sentence, he wants the truth part to be this whole aletheia realm of disclosure, open realm of disclosure, place or site or da, where truth is unveiled occurs. And the essence part in the second part, he wants to be read as being. How does being appear? Okay. Questions about the essence of truth? Is the truth of essence, or is that part? I don't know if it's transparent or incomprehensible. Dan got it the first time. I'm joking with him. Okay. The last thing I want to point out is that the Kant quote, the place where he's quoting something about Kant, and then he's also going to give a little contrast to it. This is on 136. He's talking about the fact that philosophy cannot take a standard from outside itself. He's contrasting this with any worldview notion of philosophy, or philosophy as a expression of culture, an ornament of productive mankind, as he puts it at the end of all that. But the quote from Kant is saying that effectively philosophy has to be the keeper of its own laws, not the mouthpiece of laws secretly communicated or by some implanted sense or who knows what tutelary nature. So Kant there is talking about the idea of autonomy, the idea of reason ruling itself or obeying only the laws that it gives to itself. And Heidegger is endorsing that independence and that concern only with the truth of the matter, so to speak. But at the second to last paragraph, however, whether a philosophy is keeper of its laws, that paragraph is where he's showing his disagreement with some of that formulation in Kant. Whether it fulfills its primordially decisive essence or whether it is not itself, first of all, kept and appointed to its task as keeper by the truth of that to which its laws pertain, that depends upon the primordial with which question is asked. What my reading of that is that the second of those is his own ethic, right? His own ethic is not the autonomy of reason, that it only obeys the laws that it gives to itself, but instead that philosophy is appointed to its task as keeper by the truth of that to which its laws pertain. In other words, it's appointed its tasks by being. This goes back to the openness of the comportment, right? And there's a way in which that is directly disagreeing with what Kant is saying in the passage. There's a way in which that is similar to some laws secretly communicated by an implanted sense, which you would get in Nietzsche, or by who knows what tutelary nature, like you might get in a Plato, right? And for Heidegger, it's not a tutelary nature specifically, because it's not fusus, and it's not an implanted sense, because he's not a subjectivist, but it is the directives of the truth of being as it actually appears. And whereby actually appears, we mean all the way back into that revealing sense we got back right when we made the turn. This whole direct, what's the point? The point is, some of these things that Heidegger is bringing out, even though they're about grand historical trajectories of whole civilizations, and even they're about weird inversion concepts like concealment and the mystery, he is still trying to disclose. He is trying to bring to language. He is trying to bring into the realm of the unconcealed even claims about how little can be brought into the realm of the unconcealed, right? And what I take to be the standards of truthfulness in that are the same as he enunciated back at the time of the turn. That is the change of direction where he left the traditional understanding, which is to comport with the matter at hand. And I bring this up because that was partly Josh's question, right? So certainly from Heidegger's point of view, things like the claims of scientism that scientific knowledge is exhaust what is possible to be known, and that we in principle have already figured everything out, and that sort of thing, are here being labeled as errancy and examples of a kind of closeness of comportment or denial of the always present structure of the mystery, right? There's something deeply critical there. And that could apply also to particular formations in any of the particular sciences, absolutely. Doesn't change the fact that when it comes to trying to bring to language what appears in anything brought into the open region, it is the what reveals itself such as it reveals itself in the thing that you are trying to describe that rules, and not us. That's core Heidegger, and it's there in all the ways he tries to describe these things themselves. That's why he's proceeding phenomenologically on these things, right? He's trying to tell you how the concealment appears, so to speak. Concealment does appear, it appears as a limit, right? All those sorts of things about the mystery and the errancy, right? Okay, so to me, that's part of he is still trying to not even comply with. He is still listening to the directive that, from his point of view, is something the open comportment dictates, which is that the matter that one is trying to bring to speech directs how one speaks about it. Doyle.
Is there then a proper proceeding of questioning? Like, is there proper questioning?
Yes, I mean, which doesn't mean that it's uniform, but yes, the proper comportment is the open comportment from his point of view, and the letting beings be is the proper in these matters. There is a proper in these matters. He's not someone who's saying that there is no overlying ought. We got an overlying ought at the end of the or proper at the end of the contributions book we just finished as well. It ended on such a note. I think that the way Heidegger tries to present that most commonly is that there is something like an invitational height of human's potential nature, right? At its height, human being should be the shepherd of being who tries to be the place or site where the revelation of being occurs. That is a peak possibility of the human being, and if it tries to engage with that, tries to achieve that, it is living up to something, and that living up to something is something which he is welcoming towards, pointing towards, and he's pointing to various ways in which that is, failed at, not done. But it's not the kind of ethic of a everyone can be expected to do this every day, before breakfast, or they're a bad person. It's not that kind of thing. It's a very invitational, aspirational, peak intellectual ethic, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, it's like philosophy that gives its own rules, and going back to that at the very beginning when we noticed that world reason replaced God, and world reason is giving its own rules, and I think this goes back to logic and giving its own rules. And then he said, well, philosophy, it's actually it's more, it's poetry, it's language, it's being, and it's that inception aspect that we read in contributions to philosophy, where it's the original pronouncement that is half philosophy, half poetry, half whatever it is, and that creates its own world and starts everything. Yeah.
So I mean, I'm going to largely agree with you, especially he's pointing to the Hegel he is pointing to in that section where he's talking about the replacing God with the worldly reason. That is to him a paradigm case of the denial of mystery by trying to push the explored territory to the horizon. Absolutely. If you want to see in one of his essays where he puts, put it this way, the end of metaphysics scientific world, which is how he thinks about it, in these terms, I would point to the end of philosophy and the task of thinking essay, which is actually at the end of this volume if people have this particular volume, where the whole first section is about how the end of metaphysics means something more like the establishment of the sciences and the science worldview, something like that. And then the whole second half of the essay, more like 3/4, 4/5, whatever, is about what the task for thinking is after that, so to speak, which is about all this stuff we were just talking about here. But the point is, if you want to know what he thinks of an attempt to think truth in a way that exaggerates the character of the known and underestimates the background of the mystery, I would point you to that essay as a place to where he will give it its due and then explain what he thinks remains unthought in it, so to speak. I'm going to get to Josh first because I think he has his hand up longer, then we'll get to John. But Josh.
Yeah, some of the criticisms leveled against Heidegger over the years since being in time have been, well, Heidegger doesn't present an ethic. There's no ethical point of view, and then what contributes to that is, Heidegger, and for example, in Being in Time, and I think other places too, we'll talk, for example, about the distinction between the authentic and the inauthentic. He'll remind us, he says, this is not a value judgment,
Yes.
But, but in the sense it is, or maybe, the way you articulate it, I think is the way of putting it. It's sort of an invitational stance, but there is an ought implied, just as there is an ought implied.
There absolutely is not implied. There absolutely is not implied. I think when he says it's not a value, you have to understand that he is a firm, he has all kinds of philosophical objections to the notion of value, and he thinks it's freighted with a whole bunch of baggage, and he doesn't want to invite it in by saying, oh, this is my values, right? He doesn't think the thing that he's invoking as authenticity is about values. He thinks it's about being a self, and he doesn't think the things he's invoking about the proper relation to being are values. He thinks they're about man's destiny to be the shepherd of being, and he thinks those formulations are much less misleading than value is. And he thinks that when you reduce those things to value, you're already making them a matter of legislative technology and for the rule of man's conduct. And he thinks that making something into a value is the same as making it into a tool of an instrumental reason.
Mhm.
And now he may be wrong about that, but that is his attitude towards value thinking in general. He thinks value thinking is technological to the bottom. But anyway, that's an aside on value. A lot of people who don't have that frame do not recognize that when he's saying this isn't a value, he's not saying there's no ought in it. He's saying, I don't like values as a framework for oughts. I think the value framework for oughts is based upon a misunderstanding of human action and human relation to truth that way over prioritizes human goals, and you get the point.
Yeah, and of altruistic will, right?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Okay, so that was good. John.
Okay, you can tell me if this is an inappropriate kind of line of questioning, but when he's back talking about man's flight from the mystery toward what is readily available onward from one current thing to the next, passing the mystery by. This
Yes.
is erring. He is always astray in erring.
Yes.
I'm also thinking about when I imagine this essay is being written. It's 42, 43, right?
I think the original version of this was much earlier. Was it earlier in the
Was that right?
30s? Yes.
Okay, so do you have thoughts about, I know
So
he doesn't want to stump for outcomes, political outcomes, and engage in that way,
no,
but
no.
do you think that there's any part of this that's connected to his situation?
So much of this notion of errancy as flight from self here is perfectly parallel to stuff you saw in Being in Time about fallenness of every day and about inauthenticity and about the they and all that kind of stuff. There is always in Heidegger this underlying note of resolute facing of truth, even if unpleasant or unsettling, is the core value of openness. The core value of openness is to face things, and to put it in later terms, right? And what he's highlighting here about errancy is errancy has the same flighty character that self-distraction has, right? Of ignoring your own essential possibilities that are actually your own to be distracted is a way of running away from care, right? It's a way of running away from care. And errancy has that same character, but the thing that it's running from is not care. The thing that it's coming from is a sense of being oppressed by the unknown, a sense of being lost. You can react to the almost infiniteness of the mystery with the wonder that is the comportment of the Greeks, or with the restraint that he calls the fundamental comportment of the other beginning. But you also can react to it by evasion of it, by denial of it. And he thinks that there is an enormous amount of, go to this way, the intellectual superstructure of the modern world that is about reinforcing that evasion. People do not want to admit how unknown and unexplored the world is in which they actually live. And because it is unsettling, right? But in the same way that angst was made a key thing in Being in Time, that unsettling by mystery is made a key thing here. Good question. Dan?
Yeah, I have a question for you. It's going a little bit beyond the text. It's that he's using their insistence versus existence, and insistence is kind of the bad concept. And I remember a few years ago I read Caputo's Insistence of God, and I think he took it from Derrida, and it seems like they took it in a positive way. Is it? Are you aware if they took it from Heidegger here and kind of turn it around?
I do not know where they took it from. I will say that he doesn't use this insistent in many of his other places. The focus on the existent is everywhere. The focus on the insistent is more or less only here. But the structure that he's talking about, without calling it the insistent, he talks about everywhere. The way in which the structure of the world is missed for the contents of the world, the way in which the way in which being happens is missed for the facts about the generality of beings. All of this stuff about the foreground covering over the horizon, right, is, you get that everywhere in Heidegger. The difference here is that he's locating that as a not just a potential mode of falling, but as an ever-present aspect of Dasein's nature. Dasein wants to insist. Why does Dasein want to insist? Dasein wants to insist because it wants to be safe and at home in the things that it knows. It risked and explored and underwent trials and was pained and had to adapt and everything in order to discover nuggets of truth that it hopes it can rely upon to as armor or weapons in dealing with its cares. And it does not want to be told that those are flimsy and could fall down, and that the what it does not know outweighs what it does know by a Googleplex type factor, right? So that is what he's getting at with this insistence business. But he's not tying it back to things like fear and so forth, which he easily could have if he's doing this in the being and time level.
Can we say that a God cannot exist but only insist, or something like that? And because only Dasein exists, and we still have gods in his structure.
Yes, but you have them as the possible future. It's worth bringing up why he needs them. And there's a little bit more discussion of that when we get to basic questions, when he brings up Hölderlin and such, and Nietzsche in a way, but especially Hölderlin. What's the importance of the insistence on that? The importance of the insistence on that is to show what it means for a comportment to actually be open. If I have an unopened comportment, I think I can decide ahead of time what can and cannot be, and only the intelligibles can be. If I have an open comportment, I do not know what can be, right? And the claim about Hölderlin as raising that question, the possible forever absence or return of the gods as a historical possibility is the way that Heidegger puts what he takes to be Hölderlin's question, right? There is an openness in that which is risking, from the standpoint of the modern world, everything the Enlightenment staked its all on, right? So it isn't openness unless something you care about is in potential jeopardy, right? Openness means actually recognizing the danger in the mystery of the unknown. And that's why he used, I mean, this is my own reading, but I think that is part of why he uses that. I mean, we talked about all the aspects of disenchantment of the world, et cetera, in the whole contributions structure. But yeah, there's plenty of people who are, I'll go to this way, rationalistic enough or scientific enough that they want their calculations of what counts as reasonable to be able to constrain what could possibly be allowed to be. This is the exact opposite of the letting beings be that Heidegger is talking about, right? It's exactly the attempting to constrain what could be. But anyway, this also gets to some of Josh's points about what's at stake in openness. So I do think that aspect of he wants openness to mean enough to be unsettling, enough to raise the possibility, raise uncanny possibilities, or it doesn't really count, right? There's an aspect of that in it. So some people will like that, some people will not. But for him, I think it's a core aspect of openness, is he doesn't claim that those things are calculable. He loves to say that this is not calculable. The future history of being is not calculable. All right, I've gotten through the stuff I wanted to talk about. I want to give people a chance to give reactions to the reading, to the session, to anything like that. At the end of that, I'm going to have one question about what we read next, but just in terms of how much. But first, give people a chance to have reactions.
So I have a question, sort of what you make of this. So in section 9,
yes,
the first paragraph about let's sixth line down. He said, well, the sentence starts, in the question of the truth of essence, essence is understood verbally. In this word, remaining still within metaphysical presentation, being is thought as the difference that holds sway between being and beings. And that difference is glossed in the editor's introduction as being with a Y is the ontological difference. And is he saying that that's still a metaphysical mistake to think that being with the Y is the ontological difference?
He's not responsible for the parenthetical gloss, in my opinion, right? But what he's actually trying to say here in the note, I think, which comes later, he's written this afterwards, is that when he's giving the reversal, he was not yet thinking the essence in the truth of essence second half as his full later comprehension of being, right? But it probably should be. It should be the truth of being as the unveiling of being is the right thing to think about there. But it was not the way he was formulating it. He was still formulating it within the horizon of metaphysics, and he was still thinking of it not as its own thing with its own history and its own time. He was thinking of it as the ontological difference as the unthought of metaphysics, right? So in the essence of truth first half, whose answer is the truth of essence, it's clear that the first half of it is all understood in the metaphysical terms, right? We want to know what the essence of truth is. We want to know what the one idea is across all the things that can be true. But then the answer to the question coming as the truth of essence is the unveiling of difference to show that the being as something different from the being of beings is part of the answer to the question of the essence of truth as first offered. So to me, this is still tangled up in where does he leave behind the frame of the ontological difference is the way of understanding the limitations of metaphysics to the full being notion. Contributions, some of the very last sections we read is the place where he really outlines that. He outlines how the ontological difference for him was, especially in the being time period, was an early formulation of this, but it wasn't really the right. It was enough to show that there was something missing in the metaphysical understanding, but it wasn't moving to the correct ground for the proper understanding. But I think that's also related to what he said at the very end of this on 138, where he says, the course of the questioning is trying to test itself as a transformation of relatedness to being. He's still in the process of testing that translation at the time when he reverse writes this, it seems to me. So I take 9, which is a significantly later note, to be he's not trying to retroactively take his full notion of being with a Y and put it into something he first composed in 1930 rather. But it's already pointing that way. And a full actual proper late Heidegger formulation of the paradox that the essence of truth is the truth of essence would have the second part say the essence of truth is the unveiling of the event of being with a Y, right?
Right. So then that's what he said. So then the first sentence which I read was the old being and time understanding, and then the next sentence, the true signifies the sheltering that clears as the basic characteristic of being.
Yes.
This is where it's helpful to look at the German, because this being should be with a Y.
It should.
And
it
so
should,
then,
but again, later understanding, right?
Yeah, 1949.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so well,
notice also that he says later that the sheltering that clears is, i.e., lets essentially unfold accordance between knowledge and being. The fact that he has to gloss clears as lets essentially unfold is exactly the later understanding. He's brought in the temporal aspect of the event into this, right? But I
Yeah.
think that that's late.
Yeah, and yeah, so section 9 he added in 49. But
Correct.
again, the last sentence on page 137 in basic writings,
Yes.
that being on the last line is with a Y in the German. And that makes sense. This is his
Yes.
contributions understanding.
This is related to why he says that this is a question which is fundamentally, misleading, right? I think that was, where does he say that? Yes, right, 135. 135, the glimpse into the mystery out of errancy is a question in the sense of that unique question, note it's unique, it's not a class question anymore, of what being as such is as a whole. This questioning thinks the question of the being of beings, the question is essentially misleading, and thus in its manifold meaning is still not mastered, right? So the point there is to go from the question of what being as such is as a whole to the question of how being essentially occurs is the actual development mid-30s as opposed to now that has not fully unfolded at the time when he writes 135. When he writes 135, he knows that that is not going to resolve it, right? But he doesn't have the full resolution.
He's saying there that the reasons he provided the reasons on the letter on humanism. Are you aware if those are the reasons that you just told us?
I do not think they are, but you can go look for them in the letter on humanism. You're talking about the part in 138 where he says, already in the project, the lecture on the essence of truth was to have been completed by a second lecture on the truth of essence. The latter failed for reasons which are now discussed in the letter on humanism, right? I think that the actual truth of essence stuff that he would not back away from is the later event stuff that we got through in contributions, right? Any earlier formulation of that was still in the metaphysical class truth in general frame, as opposed to being the unique event history frame, I think he would later drop. But to say that the reasons for that are disclosed in the letter on humanism, right? If you look for them, maybe because it's written in 46 or something. Fair questions. Okay, for the Heidegger scholars. All right, I want to at least quickly talk about how much of this to read next. I have two options for you. We've already mentioned, some people have already given their opinions on this, but the options are to read basically the first 50 pages, where a lot of it is going to be going over the ground of the traditional concept of truth as correspondence. Or we could go all the way to the end of part 3, which means a total reading of about 90 pages, which would get us to the Greek notion through Aristotle to the Greek notion in Aletheia. In other words, it would bring in more new material that might be of deeper interest. But the question is it too much to read 100 pages, right? So the thing reading for this time was on the order of 25, but very dense. This is not nearly as dense because it was lecture material. It has sections which are recapitulations going over in the next lecture in shorter form. What was at the beginning of later lectures, he went over, reviewed the material that was covered in the previous one in detail. So there's a fair amount of going over the same ground multiple times. So I'm just saying it's not as dense as the stuff we just read. If we only did the 50 pages for next time, we would wind up spending 3 sessions on this book. If we can do the full 90 odd, we would be able to do this in 2 sessions, where the first would be taking us all the way through Truth is Aletheia, and the second one will be taking us through the wonder as the basic comportment of the Greeks in the first beginning. I'm willing to do 2, but I'm also willing to do 3 if we have enough new people who think that the extra time would be helpful and that 50 pages is enough. So I would love people's opinions. You can say 50 pages, you can say 90 pages. You can't say 70. Pete?
Right, so I would go with do it in 3 sessions because although he's covering similar ground, I think there's interesting stuff on historicity, on really the history of being in the Greeks that I think he only covers in basic questions. And
Fair
it's
enough.
interesting to me, so I think it's worth
Doing over
spending
3.
time
Okay.
with.
And Dan, you said you do either one, or but maybe choose 50, 90, or do you have a choice now?
I read this book, so I'm fine either way, but it depends
Okay.
on what we are rushing into. If we are rushing into something better, yes, if we
Okay.
can speed it up. If not,
Do John or Doyle, James, Isabel, Joe, Josh, any of you have preferences, shorter or longer?
Either way is fine for me. The 19th is not a good day, but I'll just watch the recording.
Is there would either the 12th or the 26th be significantly better for you?
26 would work, but I don't want to hold up the group, honestly.
It's 1 week. It's not a big deal. Some people will need time to get the book. Does anyone have a problem with the 26th of January and 50 pages?
No.
Sorry, the date is Friday the 26th, you're saying?
No, Sunday the 26th.
January 2024.
No, 2025.
Oh, I see what I'm doing wrong.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're in the wrong year.
Okay. And so you're proposing the 26th.
I am proposing the 26th.
I'm good.
All right. So I will put it up, but Isabel is good with it. I will put it up later, but it's going to be for the 26th, and it's going to be the 51 pages part, so we can cover it in some detail, and that should give people time to get and read the book. I'll put the recording for this session up on YouTube later tonight.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you got something out of it. It was a good session for me. So thanks everybody, and happy holidays.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Happy
Same to
holidays.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.